how do you follow up what many consider to be the greatest video game of all time? The release of Final Fantasy VII became an unexpected success for Squaresoft. They went from a studio just looking to surpass Dragon Quest to one of the most recognizable names in the gaming industry overnight. The widespread success of Final Fantasy VII overseas had put all eyes on Squaresoft, as we anticipated the next big release in the Final Fantasy franchise. Rather than putting their focus on the next big game that could top Final Fantasy VII, Squaresoft decided it would be in their best interest to just make a game people would find fun. It was also the first time Square Enix consciously made an effort to make a game with a Western audience in mind. Final Fantasy VIII was also very experimental when it came to its story and gameplay. As a byproduct, Final Fantasy VIII is one of the more contentious entries amongst the fanbase, with some absolutely loving it and others outright despising it. Many who criticize Final Fantasy VIII point to its plot, gameplay mechanics, and an unlikable main character as just some of the problems they have with it. However, it's those same reasons so many fans, myself included, resonate so much with it. Final Fantasy VIII may not be the most well-rounded entry within the franchise, but you can see the passion its development team had for Final Fantasy VIII when making it. Understanding some of the influences, myths, and decisions behind some of the gameplay mechanics will help you gain a better appreciation for what Final Fantasy VIII was going for, especially when it comes to that narrative. Having knowledge of Final Fantasy VIII's Greco-Roman inspirations can help us better understand why Squall was represented by a lion, who Ultimecia was, and the mysteries surrounding the great god Hein. Join me in a battle as we embark on a journey to fight the evil sorceress and stop her plot to take over the world in our Final Fantasy VIII retrospective and story analysis. The release of Final Fantasy VII in 1997 changed the video game landscape, and for the ambitious developers at Squaresoft, its overnight success had become quite unexpected. Final Fantasy VII proved not only could you make a video game with enthralling gameplay, but the medium had the narrative prowess to tell compelling stories in an interactive format, in ways only games could. Squaresoft was no stranger to stories in video games. They had a slew of amazing titles under their belt already, each with rich lore, world building, and characters. What set Final Fantasy VII apart was its cinematography, and they promise 3D rendered environments could bring to the media. Final Fantasy VII not only changed the landscape of the industry forever, but put Squaresoft front and center leading the charge in the video game industry. They weren't just competing with Japanese games anymore, they were competing on a global scale, and now every Western developed game was also their competition. Once development finished up for Final Fantasy VII, the team began working on Final Fantasy VIII. This was quite well established at the beginning. They weren't looking to top Final Fantasy VII, at least not yet, but make a game people would just find fun. After all, how do you follow up what many are considering to be the greatest game ever made? That pressure alone would be enough to cripple any other studio. It was at this time things for Squaresoft began to change. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi set up a headquarters in Hawaii in order to work more closely with Hollywood and its producers to make the upcoming Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, Square's first and only foray into the world of Hollywood. He would later assemble a team and make Final Fantasy IX after vehemently disagreeing with the direction of Final Fantasy VIII. With the advent of 3D graphics, there was an ongoing debate in which direction Final Fantasy should have gone. Kitase wanted to move the series into a more realistic look, and move away from the chibi art styles the earlier Final Fantasy games had gone for, while Sakaguchi felt the chibi, more unrealistic art design was integral to the series' design. In the end, Kitase's vision won, with Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X crushing Final Fantasy IX in sales. Sakaguchi began to realize a growing ambition within many of his junior staff. many of them wanting to go off and create projects of their own. Kitase and his team had more than proven they were up for the challenge in creating a Final Fantasy game they could call all their own. Since Final Fantasy VII was such a smashing success, Sakaguchi for the first time took a step back and let them handle the development of Final Fantasy VIII entirely on their own. There were disagreements, but Kitase stuck to his guns. Yoshinori Kitase returned as director of Final Fantasy VIII, Tetsuya Nomura was left in charge of the character design, Yusuke Naoda returned as the environmental designer, and Nobuo Uematsu would once again compose a soundtrack, with Kazushige Nojima penning the story for Final Fantasy VIII. It was decided early on by Kitase and his team Final Fantasy VIII would be the first game in the franchise to actively be made for a Western audience in mind. Final Fantasy VIII, first and foremost, was a game made for Japanese audiences, with an overseas market being an afterthought due to not expecting sales to be that big in the West. Localizations of previous Final Fantasy games had typically been handled within a month's time frame. Up until this point, it was usually only one person handling the translation instead of an entire team. Since this was decided early on, Final Fantasy VIII was being made with the Western audience in mind, and more effort was put into its translation in order to draw in that Western audience. The characters were intentionally designed to look more of European descent, again catering to that Western audience that they were going for. Naoda also decided to take a lot of inspiration from Western architecture. Delling City was based off of Paris, other buildings and structures borrowed from medieval castles and Victorian architecture, and the central ruins would draw a lot of inspiration from Greco-Roman structures. The idea for the Sorceress was a cut idea from Final Fantasy VII they'd revived for Final Fantasy VIII. The Wizard of Oz books by Frank L. Baum were also a heavy inspiration for the idea of the Sorceress. Initially, it was supposed to be more pronounced connection to the Wizard of Oz, but was scaled back. But some ideas were still kept, such as Esthar being a design resembling Emerald City. You can even see on this concept map the path leading to Esthar was originally called the Yellow Brick Road. Kitase and his team envisioned a much larger role for Laguna initially. Segments of the world map had been built for Laguna but were cut ultimately due to time constraints and size of the game. Laguna was originally planned to be a foil to Squall, to even out Squall's more brash and distant personality type. In fair, Squall's secluded personality would be too hard for players to resonate with. Final Fantasy VIII's story has become a very contentious point of criticism from its detractors. Perhaps these included Laguna segments would have fleshed out his story a bit more and given the story a more overall cohesive direction. If anything, Final Fantasy VIII could benefit from a prequel covering the events of Laguna more thoroughly, and even giving us a look into the mysterious Sorcerer War we learned a little bit about from his past. The development team wanted to make Final Fantasy VIII more lighthearted. Final Fantasy VI and VII tackled very heavy themes. Because of this, both of those games had a very dark atmosphere. The main theme they wanted to go for in Final Fantasy VIII was shadows in the light, rather than a game built on finding light in darkness. They wanted a story focused around finding love on the battlefield. Final Fantasy VIII at its core was developed specifically to be a romance plot. This is all to say understanding that shift, that tone they were going for, will help you in understanding the story and how it develops into the story they were wanting to tell. Suddenly, the more childish nature of its plot starts to click into place. Final Fantasy VIII opens up with a cryptic scroll of text floating across the screen, with one of Uematsu's best compositions, Liber Fatale, playing in the background. Fun fact, Liber Fatale would mark the first time the series would use a full-on orchestra for a soundtrack rather than the MIDI files that they used up until this point. The cryptic text reads, "I'll be here. Why? I'll be here waiting. For what? I'll be here waiting, so if you come here, you'll find me." What this cryptic text means? Well, we're going to have to find out. The cinematic flashes back and forth from other cutscenes across the game, giving us just a glimpse of what we can expect from the story. Cypher and Squall are engaged in an early morning spar. Cypher slashes Squall on the face, giving him a scar, while Squall returns the favor. It's a beautifully made scene, and it's just kind of odd way to see the game considering all other entries had such a strong hook to suck you in. Despite some of the problems I have with Final Fantasy VIII's opening, I have to admit, it is a beautifully well-constructed scene. Seeing this play back on the PlayStation at the time, we dreamed of graphics being able to look that good. Those were simpler times indeed. Squall wakes up in the infirmary from the aftermath of his fight with Cypher. The wound isn't serious, but it's going to leave a scar. Dr. Katawaki calls his instructor Quistis to the infirmary to pick up her student. A mysterious girl appears in the infirmary, hinting that she knows who Squall is, but Squall has no recollection of who this mysterious girl is. Squall and Quistis make their way back to homeroom. Quistis berates Cypher for wounding Squall during practice, telling him not to do it again. After homeroom, Quistis requests to see us. She asks if we've gone to the fire cavern to acquire a low-level guardian force, Ifrit. Seeing as he doesn't have a good excuse, he agrees to go since it's a prerequisite for the field exam happening later this afternoon. We can return to Squall's desk and examine the terminal to acquire the guardian force, Shiva and Quetzalcoatl. Though it's not required reading, taking the time to read the terminal will give us some information regarding Final Fantasy VIII's world and some of the additional information on how guardian forces and magic work within the world of Final Fantasy VIII. Much of Final Fantasy VIII's world building is left behind in the menus, small missable details, and dialogue exchanges. I'll be doing my very best to bring them up as they pop up. Some I'll cover later as more plot comes to light. Squall is given the option to help a girl out finding her way around the garden. I chose to help her find her way around. Doing so will take us to a directory where you can fast travel around the garden, at least for the time being. After showing her around, Squall meets up with Quistis and they make their way to the fire cavern. You can choose a time limit to complete the cavern in. This will affect your seed exam score, but more on this later. Ifrit serves as your first fight and is extremely easy to take down, especially if you have Shiva equipped to Squall or Quistis. It's doable to take Ifrit down within the allotted 10-minute time frame, which is what we went for this playthrough. After a fight with Ifrit, Squall and Quistis make their way back to BALAMB Garden to prepare for the field exam. After a debriefing from Headmaster Sid, it's decided that Squall's squad will be made up of Cypher and Zell. Once introductions are out of the way, we are further debriefed on the situation. Galbadia invaded the small city of DOLLET some time ago for reasons unclear, but the DOLLET military has struggled to hold them off. Our mission is to go in and help back up DOLLET in their fight against Galbadia and secure the city. Making our way to BALAMB City, we can take a ship straight to DOLLET. Once inside the ship, we can talk to our teammates. I decided to talk to Quistis, who resides as the presiding instructor over this mission. Squall asked Quistis if she saw the girl who said hello to him in the infirmary earlier this morning, but she tells him she did not see who it was. Talking to Zell and Cypher will give us a look into how these two do not get along, with Cypher perhaps dropping one of the best insults in gaming history, calling Zell a chicken wuss. After talking with everyone, Cypher gives Squall the order to check outside. Squall looks off into the distance of the shore of DOLLET. Explosions, soldiers dying in turmoil on the beach, and an amazing composition by Nobuo Uematsu, making this mission a lot more badass than it has any right being. If your blood wasn't pumping before this mission, it certainly is now. Squall follows Cypher's lead, making their way into the inner parts of DOLLET City. After taking out the Galbadian soldiers stationed at the main plaza, they are left with nothing to do. Cypher points out some of the Galbadia soldiers are heading for the cliffside, and gives the order to follow them to see where they're going. To their surprise, the Galbadian army is heading towards the communications tower in DOLLET. Cypher runs ahead to see what's up top the communication tower. The girl Squall helped find her way around the garden earlier that morning introduces herself as Selphie and tells them they need to be back by 2000. The three of them follow Cypher to the top of the communication tower in order to deliver the order to him. A couple of soldiers named Biggs and Wedge are fixing the satellite. It's unclear what they want from the satellite, but I think we'll find out. Biggs and Wedge try to escape, but are stopped by Cypher, who swings his gunblade at the soldiers. Squall, Selphie, and Zell engage in a fight with Biggs and Wedge. Eventually, the two of them are swept up by a tornado summoned by a flying enemy. If you check this creature and see what it has to draw, we can acquire the Guardian Force Siren. We'll talk a little bit more about drawing here in just a little bit. After the battle, Selphie is able to tell Cypher they need to get back to the beach. Before we can make her escape though, Biggs uses a remote to activate a giant mechanical insect to chase them down. Final Fantasy VIII has small hidden gameplay mechanics that affect your seed ranking throughout the game. You don't gain money by traditional means of killing monsters in this game, and are instead paid a salary depending on the amount of steps you're taking. Depending on the actions you take during the seed exam will determine what rank you start out at and how much money you will be paid right off the bat. Since your first trek into the fire cavern, you've been secretly graded on this already. The seed exam score you get at the end is determined by what actions you took during this time. Anytime you talk to someone on the mission, you're going to lose points. Yes, this includes while you're on the ship and talking to your comrades. How many enemies you kill also has an effect on it. The higher the kill count, the higher your ranking. And the less time you have on the timer during the fire cavern also affects this. Even small things like jumping off a cliff like Selphie did will deduct your score. This also counts with the giant spider machine. You actually get more points for killing it, which is possible, but you don't get the badass cutscene with Quistis later on, and the more you encounter the spider, it also deducts points from that as well. Even shooing away the dog and saving it from the spider will also increase your seed ranking. Once you've become a seed, there are other small moments throughout the game that your actions will affect your seed ranking, and we'll cover those when they come available. After making our way to the beach, Quistis shoots down the spider as the ship begins to take off. Once we arrive at BALAMB, we can make our way back to the garden for the results of the seed exam. We make our way to the second floor and await to be called into Cid's office. There are 4 people who passed the exam: Squall, Zell, Selphie, and Nita. This is the first time we're meeting Nita, but we'll focus more on him later as he becomes much more important later on in the game. Cypher reveals Galbadia promised to pull out of DOLLET if the communication tower remained operational, making a comment if they hadn't have received the order to withdraw, they would have been heroes. Cypher is reprimanded for breaking orders, and is told he will never become a seed. After the results are given, Squall is told to go get ready for the celebration that follows. The garden hosts a giant ball in which all members are required to attend. Squall isn't exactly the social type, so he stays away from talking to anyone. With the moonlight glimmering down, Squall is caught off guard by a girl he hasn't seen before. She approaches Squall, asking him to dance with her. Squall doesn't want to, but she drags him out on the dance floor anyways. At first, Squall's hesitant to dance and even tries to get away, pretending as if he doesn't know how, but eventually gives in and dances with her. Seeing someone, she disappears, leaving Squall on the dance floor alone. After the celebration, Squall is asked by Quistis to join her in the secret place located in the training center. She orders Squall to do so he does not have a choice. Squall and Quistis make their way to the training center, with Quistis telling us we can fight the giant dinosaur known as T-Rexer pretty easily if we junction sleep. Now might be a great time to actually talk about how Final Fantasy VIII's combat works. Final Fantasy VIII's combat is one of the more contentious points for many fans, some completely disregarding the game as broken because of it. While I certainly agree with people it can become tedious, I feel many blow it out of proportion to justify why they hate it. Final Fantasy VIII has more ways of creating magic than just the draw system. It's part of the reason Final Fantasy VIII gives players such a wide variety of ways to create magic. Other criticism thrown its way is how easily it is to cheese the game early on, therefore it's broken. I disagree. Most wouldn't have known how to do this or what spells actually made you stronger and what magic was better for what stat. Those who are so adamant that the game is bad, I think, push this point way too hard to justify the game as terrible. I'll openly admit Final Fantasy VIII has its flaws, but it's far from being the broken mess some try to make it out to be. Yet, those are also opinions I can respect. Addressing the criticism aside, let's actually break down what is possibly one of Final Fantasy's series' most complex ways of leveling up. Like all Final Fantasy games since Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VIII uses the ATB gauge. Once the ATB gauge is full, your party members will be able to take an action. Basics such as attack, magic, and item are present and work pretty similarly to how you'd expect. The exception being magic. Since your character stocks magic, you don't have MP. Magic is treated like a consumable rather than using classic MP. Final Fantasy VIII adds some additional commands available for use. Let's cover the basics every Guardian Force comes with. We've already covered magic and item commands, so let's focus on draw commands, which becomes very important in Final Fantasy VIII's core gameplay. Much like other Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy VIII also has an in-game reason as to why magic exists in its world. The magic used in Final Fantasy VIII isn't magic in the traditional sense, but is referred to as paramagic. It was discovered by a scientist named Dr. Odine after he studied a sorceress for some time. He learned all living things were made up of elements, therefore magic could be drawn from creatures across the world. Magic itself isn't super strong, but by equipping the magic through the junction system using a Guardian Force, which I'll just be calling by its abbreviated name from now on, a GF, gives a person an immense amount of strength. It does list memory loss as a potential side effect though. By using the draw command, you can stock up magic or you can draw it and automatically cast it. The other command each GF comes equipped with is, of course, GF. This summons your GF for an attack. After the GF is summoned, their name appears over the character's name with their HP and a blue bar will begin to count down before they appear. During this time, all damage a party member receives will be received by the GF instead. If the GF's HP reaches 0, they won't be able to use it in battle anymore until they are revived, thus interrupting the summoning process. Once the GF is summoned, they'll use a special attack and deal damage to the enemy. Other abilities exclusive to GFs are Treatment, Dark Side, and Mad Rush. Treatment cures a party member of all status effects, Mad Rush will cast Haste, Protect, and Berserk on a party member, and Dark Side will double your attack at the cost of your HP. And these are just a few of the available abilities that you start out with. There are many, many more. Final Fantasy VIII is quite a bit different from your other RPGs, since your characters don't equip armor. As previously mentioned, equipping magic to a GF will give you various different stat increases depending on the magic equipped. This is trial and error to see what is increased, but any spell will increase that stat. For instance, putting a cure spell on your HP will increase the amount of HP your characters have. The more you have, the higher your HP. You can also stock 100 of each spell with each character. However, once you hit that, that's as far as you can go with that particular spell, and that's as high as it will increase that stat. Equipping Haste to Speed will increase your character's speed. Some GFs are able to learn elemental attacks and defense stat junction. Say adding fire to an elemental attack will add a fire effect to your weapon, making you deal more damage to ice enemies. Equipping fire to elemental defense will make you take less damage from fire. Junctioning spells to a status attack junction and status defense junction act similarly. Quistis hinted at this by telling us how to defeat T-Rexer, so we'll use this as an example. Equipping Sleep to the status attack junction will add the effect of sleep to your weapon, letting you put your enemy to sleep. You can also apply this with Blind, Slow, Poison, and Silence. Similarly, equipping one of the spells to the stat defense will increase your chance of nullifying that status element from afflicting a party member. The more the stat magic you have equipped, the higher the chance of nullification. Your GFs are able to learn various different abilities, from stat junction to actual stats. Everything you need to learn will be learned via AP you receive from battle. The most valuable abilities you'll learn are through magic refining abilities. Refining abilities let you turn items into magic, and cards that you can turn into items that can then be turned into magic. The way you're able to power up your characters is limitless. You can even draw magic from the field through draw points. This is partially why I think the outcry over drawing from battles is overblown, because there are so many ways to acquire magic. As a matter of fact, 50% of the game I ran around with encounters just off, completely avoiding battles. Unlike other Final Fantasy games, your enemies level up with you, rendering grinding for higher levels completely pointless. Most of the game I was below 30. Even monsters don't net you money. You can sell what they give you, but your seed rank will net you a salary. You are mercenaries after all, so the amount of steps you take will result in you getting paid. Another common complaint levied at the game is how you can break the game within Disc 1. While this is true if you don't have prior knowledge or aren't looking for builds to break the game, then you're not going to know that Siren can learn Life Magic Refinement, buy a bunch of tents, and use her ability to refine those tents into Curaga for over 3000 HP for each character. You also wouldn't know that you could learn Card Mod with Quetzalcoatl, challenge people in Balamb Garden to obtain a card named Agala, use Card Mod to turn that into Mysterious Fluid, then learn Status Magic Refinement from Diablo and refine those into Meltdowns for one of the best spells to equip to your physical defense in the game. The truth is, you're probably going to struggle. Learn by trial and error. Learn what magics junction best to what stat. This is but one other way I feel people who dislike the game simply throw it in as a gotcha. The junction system isn't perfect, and I'll admit that. I think at another chance to try something similar, Square could have refined it and knocked it out of the park. But I have always enjoyed the trial and error of the junction system and learning yourself what spells work best. It's definitely a step back from the more refined Magicite materia systems of Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, but Final Fantasy VIII tries something new and it should at least receive credit for it. After a fight with T-Rexer, Squall and Quistis make their way to the secret place. Quistis tells Squall she is no longer an instructor, citing leadership qualities being one of the reasons. Squall isn't too happy with Quistis telling him this and tells her to go talk to a wall. Quistis asks Squall if he ever wants to just talk to someone about his problems. Squall simply replies, "What is he supposed to say about other people's problems? Everyone needs to take care of their own problems." Finishing off with saying he doesn't want to burden himself with anyone else's problems. Many are taken aback by Squall's abrupt rudeness during this scene. This is one of the scenes many cite when they criticize Squall's personality. Perhaps my own introspection on the scene might help you understand Squall and why many fans resonate so much with Squall, despite him coming off as rude. Squall, by definition, is an introvert. He doesn't like to socialize, and he doesn't like to talk about his feelings. This scene is meant to make Squall seem flawed and show how much growing he has to do. Quistis tries to talk to Squall about her problems, but Squall doesn't want to hear it because he struggles solving problems of his own, much less feel like he's equipped to deal with other people's problems and tell them how to fix them. It's overwhelming sometimes to hear what other people are going through when you have problems of your own and struggle to find ways to articulate those feelings to begin with, especially when you feel vulnerable or feel like you're going to expose yourself if you open up. There's also the fact Squall is Quistis' student and the ethical nature of how she's acting. Despite there only being an age difference of a year, it's in fact she is his superior and instructor, someone who has authority over Squall. Quistis has also hinted at having romantic feelings for Squall, and is evident Squall doesn't reciprocate those same feelings. Quistis also drags Squall out here as one last attempt to show feelings after she saw him dancing with Renoa. She even makes a comment about him dancing with someone else, but she won't with me. Quistis all but admits later she has feelings for him and had given up when Renoa came into the picture. Squall also had an extremely long day. He woke up early to train with Cypher, received a wound which probably hurts like hell, had to go to the fire cavern, had the seed exam, and now after midnight it's clear Squall is just tired. Sure, Squall could have handled the situation a bit better, but taking a look at his insecurities and the situation at hand with Quistis, he probably saw this as a moment he could finally say how he felt, since Quistis was no longer his superior and there were no ramifications for calling her out for her actions. Squall and Quistis leave the training center together, only to hear a girl screaming, "Squall, Quisty." Quisty, huh? That's an interesting name for Quistis. A monster from the training center is attacking the girl from the infirmary we saw earlier. The girl's name is Elone. After a fight with the insect and his lackeys, Squall retires for the night. The next morning, Squall is awoken by a shout into his dorm. They've got their first mission. Squall makes his way down to the front gate to receive his mission debriefing. Joining Squall in this mission is Zell and Selphie. They are to go to Timber and help the Timber Owls, a resistance group fighting for the liberation of Timber, which currently resides under Galbadian control. Cid gives us a magic lamp, sending us on our way. If we examine the lamp within the menu, it will throw us into a battle with Diablo. Defeating him will give us access to a GF. Squall, Zell, and Selphie hitch a ride to Timber via train from BALAMB. Upon entering the passengers' quarters, they instantly collapse and enter a dream state. The scene shifts to 3 Galbadian soldiers, Laguna, Kiros, and Ward. They seem to be lost in a forest. After running around for a bit, they hop into a car and make their way to Delling City, the capital of Galbadia. During their time off, Laguna, Kiros, and Ward visit a hotel in Delling City. Laguna, Kiros, and Ward are regulars here since Laguna fancies the pianist who's playing here, Julia. Laguna is hell-bent on talking to Julia and uses this chance to strike up a conversation with her by approaching the piano, but gets nervous and walks away after saying his leg cramped up. What a chicken wuss. Laguna makes his way back to Kiros and Ward, considering it a success since he at least approached her. Kiros and Ward can see Julia approaching from the distance and offer to pay for the drinks for the night, leaving Laguna behind to talk to her. Julia introduces herself to Laguna and the two of them talk, eventually making their way back to her hotel room. Laguna starts talking about his experiences in the Galbadian army, but realizes he's focusing way too much on himself and asks Julia what her dreams are. She tells him she wishes to sing, but is unable to write music herself. Laguna gives her encouragement, telling her he'd love to hear her sing. The conversation is cut short though once Kiros and Ward knock on the door, telling them they have a new assignment from Galbadia. Laguna was originally supposed to play a much bigger part, but unfortunately a lot of it was cut from the game. Laguna at one point had his own portion of the map he would be able to explore, and while those segments are necessary to understand what's going on, many fans, myself included, wanted to learn a little bit more about Adele, the Sorceress War, and Esthar. Having more context from Laguna would have helped bridge some of the gaps many fans feel were left from the game. Squall wakes up from his dream. It seems Zell and Selphie have been awake for a bit. After discussing amongst themselves, they realize they all had the same dream, concluding it could have been a gas attack of some sorts, as there is many people around the world who do not like Seed. Realizing there is nothing they can do about it right now, they depart for Timber. The train arrives at the Timber station. A man at the station says to Squall, the Timber forest sure has changed, with Squall following up, but the owls are still around to indicate that they are the Seed who have been sent to help them out. The man introduces himself as Watts. He escorts us over to the train they will be using for the upcoming mission. Once in the train, we are introduced to Zone and another member of the Timber Owls resistance group. Squall is tasked with going and fetching the princess from the back room, none too happy about using an elite mercenary force to perform such a simple task. An order is an order though, and he goes back to the train to grab the young girl. The young girl looks familiar. It's the same person Squall danced with the night before. She introduces herself as Renoa and introduces her dog Angelo. Renoa is excited that Seed has shown up, since she was unsure if they were going to get any help in assisting against the capture of President Delling. Squall and Renoa make their way back to the meeting room and begin the debriefing. Renoa explains they need our help capturing President Delling. Our objective with this minigame is to decouple the train cars and capture the president in his. In order to do this, we'll need to input a series of numbers in order to complete the code. Each train car we decouple has red and blue soldiers in it. We need to make sure we are not seen by the soldiers. I kind of miss video games when they would put these small mini games like this to break up the gameplay and story. Though the gameplay is just simple and basic here, it is one of the moments in Final Fantasy VIII when someone brings it up or when I talk about it, I really start to reminisce about. There's just something about this minigame and the adrenaline you get from the mission that just makes it one of the more fun elements of Final Fantasy VIII to experience. After successfully decoupling the trains, we can make our way to the president's car. Galbadia was expecting the Timber Owls to pull something and had heard rumblings that they were plotting to kidnap the president. As extra precaution, they decided to put a body double in the train just in case they tried to pull this stunt. Sid contracted Seed to help out Timber Owls until they are liberated from Galbadia, which means Squall is not too happy about it considering he has no idea how long this is going to take. He also becomes frustrated at the fact Renoa isn't taking this operation seriously, but an order is an order and he has to obey. The Galbadian army plans to use the Timber TV station to make a broadcast. We need to get to the broadcast station. After fighting their way through some Galbadia soldiers, they arrive at the TV station. There hasn't been a broadcast on TV for years, for plot-related reasons we are going to get in much later in this retrospective. So this is a big deal. President Delling plans to give a speech introducing the world to the new sorceress, in what can only be seen as a ploy to scare the masses. Sorceresses are usually bad news. Most of them are power-hungry and hell-bent on ruling the world. Rinoa, Zone, and Watts plop down on the ground to discuss tactics, deciding to barge in guns ablaze. Squall calls them out for their stupidity. Their childless nature is not only going to get them killed and have the team killed, but Rinoa, Zone, and Watts as well. Not to mention there could be serious ramifications for doing so. Innocent people could die inside who were just working in the TV station. Everyone points to Squall as being rude at this moment, but he's the only one using his brain at this point. Squall made the right call here to call them out. Before Delling is able to make his announcement though, Cypher and Quistis show up to crash the party. Quistis orders the members of Seed deployed in Timber to make their way to the TV station if they are watching. Cypher is holding the president hostage with his gunblade to his neck. Cypher makes his way off the set and we follow them. Zell lets slip they are from BALAMB Garden, which isn't a good thing because now that means we have a target for blaming the attempted assassination on the president. A mysterious force stops the party from being able to continue and the sorceress appears. She takes pity on Cypher, telling him to come with her and fulfill his dream of becoming her knight. With no way to get back to Galbadia Garden, it's decided they'll need to make their way to the nearest garden, which is Galbadia Garden. Galbadia Garden and Galbadia Military are two separate entities. Though most of the soldiers from Galbadia Army are recruited from the garden, it doesn't mean the garden follows orders directly from the army themselves. On our way to Galbadia, we find ourselves passing through the forest. Zell is pretty beat up about the whole ordeal of letting him slip, and Rinoa reprimands Squall for not showing support. But before they really have time to process anything or talk about it, they fall into a sleep and are again thrown back into a dream with Laguna, Kiros, and Ward. This time, Laguna, Kiros, and Ward find themselves in an excavation site somewhere in Centra. The Centra Empire used to be a large thriving empire back in the day, but an event called the Lunar Cry wiped them off the map. The Lunar Cry is an event that calls monsters down from the moon when the lunar eclipse aligns with the Crystal Pillar. The Esthar army is currently in the process of removing the Crystal Pillar into a device known as Lunatic Pandora. With the crystal inside of Lunatic Pandora, this gives Adele, the residing sorceress of the Galbadian War, the ability to use the Crystal Pillar and summon a Lunar Cry anytime she wants, thus letting her send an terroristic attack to any empire or country that decides to stand against her. Laguna, Kiros, and Ward make their way through the excavation site and into Lunatic Pandora, but suffer severe injuries from the fight with Esthar soldiers. Seeing some ships they can escape on, they jump into the ocean below and make their way to safety. Squall and company wake up. Quistis was bewildered by the events that happened. Squall and party tell Quistis this isn't the first time they've dreamt about Laguna. With no real idea of what's going on, they make their way back to Galbadia Garden. Zell begins to wonder if there's going to be a retaliation on the garden for letting slip that they were from BALAMB. But they begin to wonder what happened to Cypher, speculating he may have been executed for attacking the president. The past tense talk about Cypher strikes a chord with Squall, refusing to become just a memory people talk about when he passes on. Squall lets out an outburst and leaves. An announcement is made over the intercom to the members of Seed, telling them to go to the front gate of Galbadia Garden for their next mission. The Galbadian sorceress, Edia, and the Galbadian army plan to use Galbadia Garden as their base. As you can imagine, this does not bode well with the headmaster of Galbadia Garden, Martine. It's decided with the help of the Galbadia Garden, Seed will execute a full-on assassination attempt against the sorceress. Squall calls out they don't have a sharpshooter to carry out the assassination attempt, but Galbadia has them covered. Our last member, Irvin Kenius, joins the party. With our party acquired, let's quickly go over each character's limit breaks. We are told by Martine we'll need to find General Caraway for further plans on how to carry it out. Arriving at Delling City, we make our way to General Caraway's manor, but before we can enter, we need to prove we are worthy of freaking course. The soldier outside his manor tasks us with going to the tomb of the unknown king and acquiring a random student ID number, then reporting back to him with it. While we're at the tomb of the unknown king, we decide to get the brothers GF. Once we have the code, we can get back to the soldier and make our way into Caraway's manor. Rinoa breaks the silence that Caraway is her father. Their relationship is rocky at best. It's clear Rinoa has some daddy issues. General Caraway escorts the party to their post and explains how the assassination attempt is going to go down. Squall and Irving will make their way up to a vantage point from which they will be able to shoot the sorceress from. The spot this happens to be will be indicated by the sniper rifle left behind. During the course of the parade, Edia's float will make its way around Delling City and pass right under the gate connecting the two parts of the city together. Here, the gate team will come into play. Inside the gate is a switch which will lower the gates and block the sorceress between both gates, giving Irving the perfect shot. Squall and Irving head to their post and prepare for the attempt. Irving is a bit nervous about the shot, saying he tenses up every time and he can't do it. Squall isn't having it and tells Irving to just shoot. If he misses, he will handle the rest and direct attack the sorceress herself. Meanwhile, Quistis, Selphie, Zell, and Rinoa find themselves back at Caraway Manor. Rinoa has plans to give the sorceress an amulet made by Dr. Odine, which has the power to drain the sorceress of her powers. Unsure of how well it will work, Quistis isn't too keen on using it. She also calls into question how they even get close enough to the sorceress to get her to use it. Quistis goes ham on Rinoa, who insists they try and calls her out for her childish games, saying this is a serious operation. Quistis, Zell, and Selphie leave for the gate to prepare for the assassination. General Caraway tells Rinoa it's too dangerous and that she needs to stay here. In order to lock Rinoa into the room, General Caraway puts a timer on the door for it to lock itself. But Rinoa decides she's going to help out and decides to go talk to Sorceress Edia herself, presenting the amulet as a gift. Quistis begins to think she was a bit harsh on Rinoa. With a little bit of time left before the parade, they make their way back to Caraway's manor, where they left Rinoa, but Rinoa isn't there. The lock Caraway puts on the door shuts automatically, with Quistis, Zell, and Selphie now inside with no way to get out. The three of them desperately look for something to break the lock, but to no avail. Quistis then takes a cup and places it on the hand of a statue, revealing a secret passage which conveniently leads them directly through a sewer and to the gate they need to carry out the assassination. Rinoa makes her way to the sorceress's manor where she is to give her speech. The attempt to give the amulet goes about as well as you'd expect, and Edia ends up putting Rinoa into a trance. Edia then proceeds to kill the president, insult the audience, and pretty much say she will bring a reign of terror across the world. Many have wondered why the audience just cheered in excitement. It was confirmed in an interview by Katase. She put everyone in the crowd into a trance and gave her speech of world domination. Meanwhile, Squall and Irvin make their way to the gate and see Rinoa up top with the sorceress. Wondering what she's doing up there, they decide to go rescue her first. After fighting a couple lizard-like creatures the sorceress summons, Rinoa is scared and tells Squall not to leave her side. Rinoa ends up finding a hatch we can go down, and we see the sniper rifle set up, meaning this is the vantage point we needed to get to. Irvin prepares to shoot, but misses as Edia puts up a shield. Squall leaps from the perch, hijacks the car, and rams it right into the gate, jumping inside to confront the sorceress herself. We need to fight our way through Cypher before we can fight Edia directly. Once Squall defeats Cypher, Irvin and Rinoa show up to back him up. After a direct fight with Edia, she lunges a spear of ice into his left shoulder and Squall falls off the float and onto the ground. As much as I enjoy the high energy of this scene, there is a lot wrong with it. First of all, the blocking in the scene is completely off. The vantage point where Irvin needs to make a shot is behind Edia's float. Right where Edia sits is a massive part of the float blocking her entire body. There is also the way Quistis reacts to Rinoa. Maybe, just maybe, it would have been better to apologize after the assassination was completed instead of leaving post and making their way back to Caraway's manor in order to talk to her then. I can't fault Rinoa for going to the sorceress, as dumb as that is. It isn't out of character for her considering how naive she was back in Timber, so this makes sense. Some time has passed since Laguna's time in the Galbadian military. After his wounds, he was hauled into a small village of Windhill where a lady named Rain nursed him back to full health. Laguna had multiple broken bones due to his injuries. He lives in an empty house next to the local pub of Windhill owned by Rain. Living with Rain is a young girl named Alone. This is the very same Alone that we saved back in the training center in BALAMB Garden. Windhill is constantly at the mercy of monsters making their way into town. In order to pay his debt to the town that saved his life, Laguna takes it upon himself to patrol Windhill and make sure the monsters don't attack anyone in town. Elone comes to wake up Laguna, telling him an oddly dressed man is in the pub to see him. Taking the lead, Laguna makes sure it's clear and runs to the pub, with Elone following behind him. The man waiting for Laguna is Kiros. We ask Kiros some questions and learn what Ward is currently doing. He's currently working in the desert prison as a janitor. He's unable to talk thanks to the wounds he received back at the excavation site. Julia went on to marry a man named General Caraway and wrote a pop song about a soldier she loved who never came back from war. Kiros is surprised Laguna has settled down here and wonders what is drawing him to stay in this town. In a lot of ways, it feels like he's indebted to the town since they nursed him back to health. Kiros asks Laguna if he still has dreams about becoming a journalist who wants to travel the world, and that the editor of Timber Mannix is interested in any articles that involve traveling around the world. Kiros and Laguna decide to take a rest before the next patrol. When the party comes to after the dream sequence, they find themselves locked in a cell in the desert prison. Quistis, Zell, Selphie, and Renoa are sharing a cell together. A couple of the prisoner wardens ask if one of them is named Renoa, asking her to come with them. General Caraway has asked for his daughter's release. Zell, Selphie, and Quistis still need to find a way to escape. Meanwhile, Squall wakes up with no visible signs of a wound from the ice shard that was launched in his chest, even making a comment about it. I'm still kinda puzzled about how on earth Squall survived this wound. 'Tis but a flesh wound, I guess. Cypher begins to interrogate Squall, asking him what the true purpose of seed is. Squall is a bit taken aback since he should know it. You're given a chance to spill the beans or stick to your guns and continually be shocked. Squall passes out either way, and the scene flashes back to the other party members. The party has come up with a way to escape their cell. Zelfie and Quistis lay on the ground as Zell yells for the warden. As the warden opens up, Zell says, "I think the girls were bitten by a snake." Zell proceeds to punch him in the gut so they can get their weapons back. This prison break scene could have been written so much better. Look, I love Final Fantasy VIII, but I've got to call out bad writing when I see it, and this is just comically bad. This feels like a scenario out of a creating writing assignment you'd expect to get back from a very creative fourth grader. After they find their weapons, the party must find their way up to the top floor to rescue Squall. After making their way up to save Squall, the party needs to make their way back down to the bottom of the prison in order to escape. Zell splits up with the rest of the party since he just had a dream about Ward and knows the way around the prison, so he knows how to operate the controls. After making their way to the bottom, they realize the prison is burrowed underground, meaning there's no way for them to actually exit. Hearing gunshots, they realize Zell may be in trouble and start to make their way back to the top. Irvin and Renoa show up to help break them out. The party makes their way up top of the prison with Zell's help and eventually makes their escape from Desert Prison. Irvin gets intel that they plan to retaliate against BALAMB Garden by launching missiles at both BALAMB and Trabia, another garden located towards the top of the world map. The party decides to split into two, where one party goes to stop the missile at the missile base, and the other will head to BALAMB Garden to warn that the missiles are heading their way. The first set of missiles launch and head straight for Trabia Garden. Selphie decides to lead the mission to stop the missiles since Trabia was her garden that she transferred from. Squall will lead the party back to BALAMB. The other party members are solely made up of who you decide to take with you. I decided to take Renoa since Final Fantasy VIII is building a romance for them to be a couple, and it's going to give us a few extra scenes to establish that relationship just a little bit more. I also took Quistis along with Squall since this is the party that I plan to make my main trio. That left Irvin and Zell to go with Selphie. Depending on how we approach the missile base will determine how things are. Continuously running on the catwalk will alert the guards. Obviously, just selecting the option to fight will also increase the amount of random counters you have in. The dialogue options you choose play a huge part in how easy this mission is. Eventually, you will be found out and get access to the missile computer system, and you'll want to change the missile's area ratio to stop them from hitting the garden. Selphie also sets the self-destruction sequence to blow up the missile base. Leaving the missile base, we're encountered by a giant tank we have to fight in its parking lot. Before the base blows up, the missiles are launched and head straight for BALAMB Garden. The party realizes they have no way to escape, and come to the conclusion this might just be the end for them. Squall, Quistis, and Renoa arrive at BALAMB Garden to see everything in disarray. Members of Seed seem to be fighting amongst each other. Squall is immediately asked by the Garden faculty if he is with Garden Master Norg or Headmaster Cid. Who the hell Norg is, we have no idea at this point. We've had no introduction to who this mysterious Garden Master actually is. The decision's kind of up to you depending on how many battles you want to fight, but we need to find Headmaster Cid and tell him about the missiles heading towards BALAMB Garden. After making his way into every room in the garden, Zoo appears telling us that Headmaster Cid has been in his office this entire time. I guess you fake hiding him in the other places and hide him in the most likely area he would be in. Okay, I guess. Squall tells Headmaster Cid that the missiles are heading straight for BALAMB Garden. Without a real solution, Headmaster Cid tells Squall that the garden was built upon some central mobile shelter. If they can find a way down there, maybe they can fly the garden out of harm's way. With little options, we go down the elevator shaft into the lower parts of the garden. Finding the controls, they press some buttons and are instantly elevated up to a platform to find themselves in Headmaster Cid's office once again. This office is now the bridge of BALAMB Garden. Just as we start to drift away from the spot Garden once stood, the missiles hit the ground, creating an explosion as the garden drifts off into the ocean. Fun little fact, I recently learned during this playthrough too that depending on what you choose for the missile aspect ratio, if you don't mess with it, it is actually possible to blow up BALAMB Garden. Who knew, right? Squall, Quistis, and Rinoa are summoned to speak to Garden Master Norg, who funded the garden when Headmaster Cid approached him all those years back. Norg also lets slip that Sorceress Edia is Cid's wife. I remember this being a pretty big shock. The revelation that Cid was sending us to kill his own wife back in the day was pretty intense. Norg, who knows that we are the team that tried to assassinate the sorceress, plans to put our heads on a platter and serve them up to her, to pledge allegiance to her. What a coward. Squall is not having it and fights Master Norg. We're able to draw Leviathan from Norg if we want to, and after the fight, he gets enwrapped in some circular cocoon or shell-like thing and seemingly appears to be dead. With Master Norg dead, there's really no need for the Seed to fight anymore, so all seems to be peaceful back at the garden. With things dying down, Squall retires to his dorm to take a rest. Rinoa asks Squall for a tour around the garden. This is one of those few extra scenes we can get if we take Rinoa around with us. This is where many fans start to feel a disconnect with Squall and the way the game plays. Depending on the dialogue options you make Squall choose, he can be a straight-up ass to Rinoa or treat her somewhat like a human being. The illusion of choice here does nothing for this game at all. As a matter of fact, it feels like it does more harm to Squall's character than anything. Perhaps they took a lot of inspiration from Western games coming out at the market at the time and felt the dialogue would enhance their game, making it appeal more to the West. The biggest mistake with this is it sets the romance between Squall and Rinoa back and makes it completely unbelievable. It's hard to believe she would keep pursuing an interest with Squall if the player simply kept being an ass to her. Final Fantasy VIII is best played picking Squall's colder options in the beginning, and as Rinoa works her way on his heart, then picking the options where he opens up to her a bit more, simply because it lines up with his character and that natural progression. This method of choosing is counterintuitive to the way the game's choices and dialogue are actually meant to play out. Simply adding character choices to an interpersonal character-driven story is never a good thing, and frankly in Final Fantasy VIII, it just kinda derails the story in my opinion, and completely goes against what dialogue options are actually supposed to do in an RPG. As the garden drifts, we can press Headmaster Cid for more info regarding the revelation from Norg earlier, and ask him who Norg was. Norg was a member of the Shumi tribe who helped fund the garden. Norg made the initial investments in order to turn a profit, and they sent Seed out to accomplish various tasks around the world. On one hand, you had Headmaster Cid, who didn't want the garden to be used for military purposes necessarily. Their goal was always to be trained in combat so they could defeat the sorceress. But like any investor or business owner, you need to continue a profit in order to make things work. This was where Norg came in. Norg is just kinda one of those included moments in Final Fantasy VIII where there was some foreshadowing or hinting going on, at some tension building up towards the beginning of Final Fantasy VIII, but it's ultimately just a plot that's resolved and done too quickly, leaving the players scratching their head about what this sequence was even supposed to be about. On the flip side though, The Norg subplot doesn't really add anything to the story or really take anything away from it, so focusing on it wasn't really necessary either. It's not like the Sorceress War, where I found myself with the insatiable urge to want to learn more about it, but never did. A White Seed ship shows up and asks for Elone. They want to take her away. We don't really know much about these guys, and Squall is very hesitant to obviously trust them, but Headmaster Cid apparently knows who they are, so that does relieve some of the tension the party has to let Elone go with them. Whoever these people are, their intent on protecting Elone is first and foremost, so it seems she's in good hands. Eventually, the garden ends up drifting to Fisherman's Horizon and crashing into the town, smack dab right in the middle of the ocean. Headmaster Cid tells Squall, Questus, and Rinoa to investigate the town and find the mayor. Visiting Fisher's Horizon's mayor, he seems not to want us there and doesn't waste any time cutting to the chase. He wants to know when we're leaving, as our presence will no doubt bring violence to the village. Fisherman Horizon's mayor strives to keep the village as peaceful as possible. He wants Fisherman's Horizon to basically be a place where one goes when they don't have anywhere else to go. A fresh start, if you will. Being Seed, they will just cause Galbadia and other enemies to show up. Squall tells the mayor they are stuck there until they can fix the garden, stating that they just found out that it could fly. The mayor offers to help them and repair it so they can be on their way. Upon leaving though, Galbadia shows up and the mayor decides to go talk to them. This doesn't end up going well. Galbadia is at Fisherman Horizon to find Elone, and they won't stop until they find her. With no other options and against the mayor's wishes, we fight Galbadian soldiers off, saving his life. A tank shows up to fight the party. This looks an awful lot like the tank we fought back in the missile base. After the boss fight, it backs up and falls into the ocean. Selphie, Zell, and Irvin crawl out before it falls into the ocean. The mayor isn't too happy with the results of violence to save his life, but Squall and him kind of agree to disagree and they move on. Needless to say, preparations to finish repairing the garden continue. After the garden is fixed, Squall is appointed leader and left control of the garden's operations. Selphie wants to throw him a party to welcome him as their new leader. She plans to throw a musical number and have a romantic night between Squall and Rinoa. There are a few instruments where we can choose from here. Our goal is to find which instruments go together best. What you choose for instruments will have an effect on Squall and Rinoa's date. For instance, if you choose instruments that don't go well together, it just pisses Rinoa off because the music sounds so bad. Oddly, playing the game's main theme, Eyes on Me, will cause Squall and Rinoa to argue just a little bit. The best result is to play the Irish song. We've started to see Squall ever so slightly open up to Rinoa. We've seen Rinoa has slowly begun to chip away at his heart. Squall and Rinoa engage in some playful behavior. I think many misunderstand. Squall does care about people. His friends and comrades do mean a lot to him. It's not just the way he interacts with Rinoa. He shows a great deal of care when the missile base party returns safely. Where many have a hard time with Squall is how he has such a hard time showing his feelings. It's at this point we've seen flashbacks of Squall calling out for someone called Sis. Whoever this person was, the separation from her clearly had an effect on Squall. It's hard for many to understand why he would be like this, but perhaps I can shed some light on why he has such a hard time expressing those feelings, as I've had similar experiences. The loss of Squall Sis hurt him so much it was easier to put up barriers and not let anyone else in. That feeling of abandonment, that feeling of loneliness is a lot to deal with. It's a lonely life being a lone wolf, but it's easier to deal with that pain than losing someone again. Suddenly, understanding Squall starts to make sense. Squall giving Questus the cold shoulder when she opened up to him that night in the training center starts to click and make more sense. Helping her out, listening to her feelings, it would have opened him up, and that pain of losing her. Squall has his own problems, his own flaws, things he needs to deal with. He was just as much broken inside as she was, and how he was supposed to help her when he couldn't even help himself weighed heavily on him. Squall's journey is overcoming these insecurities and becoming the leader he needs to be, learning that he needs to accept his friends and that his friends are going to be there just as much as they need him to be there for them. With the reunited party and a fixed garden, we're finally able to explore the world for the very first time. Our next destination is the town of BALAMB. Floating over it is Galbadia Garden. Not only was Edea able to successfully take over the garden, but apparently she found a way to make it fly. Galbadia has taken over the city in search of Elone. It seems the sorceress is after her. Why is currently unknown. Galbadia isn't letting anyone in, even residents of BALAMB. Zell is obviously quite frustrated since he lives here. Squall is eventually able to convince the soldiers guarding the entrance to let them in by telling him that they have information about Elone. Galbadia has made hold in the hotel for their headquarters. Visiting Zell's house, her mother tells us that they are looking for Elone, and if anyone does anything that threatens the Galbadian operations, they will burn down the entire village. The Galbadian army is using the hotel for their base of operations, but in order to get in, we're going to need to talk to the commander, and we'll need to hunt down the captain in order to do that. The captain is known for taking frequent naps instead of patrolling like he's supposed to. We head to the docks and talk to a couple of guards with a dog. They tell us the captain was fishing here just a moment ago, but ran off after he got a catch. We head back to Zell's house. His mom tells us this man just broke into her house, cooked up a fish, making her whole kitchen stink like fish. Running back to the docks, we talk to the dog. Sniffing out the fish, he runs to the train station, uncovering the captain. Raijin is our captain. He pops out from his hiding place in the train and runs to the hotel. After arriving at the hotel, we get a glorious scene of Rajan getting his ass beaten by Fujin for sleeping on the job. After a quick fight with Rajan, we make our way into the hotel and pick a fight with Fujin. During this fight with Fujin, we can extract the GF Pandemona. With Fujin and Rajan defeated, they pull out of BALAMB, and since Elone is not there, they decide to look elsewhere. Sylphie wants to go to Trabia and see the damage done by the missile, so we make our way to the wintry continent up north. Upon arrival, we can see the damage that's done. The missile has done quite a bit of damage. We can see that the missile is still lodged in the ground, and the students of Trabia are in bed, and some of them are clearly very hurt. They've been through a lot. Squall decides to give Sylphie some time to talk to her friends. She tells us that she'll meet us at the basketball court when she's ready. Once everyone arrives at the basketball court, Irvin opens up about when he was a kid. He grew up in an orphanage. It was there the sorceress Edea took care of him. The children in the orphanage called her matron. It's here that Irvin drops the bombshell. Those children were Squall, Sylphie, Quistis, Zell, Cypher, and Elone. It's revealed the reason everyone forgot was because they used GFs. Junctioning a GF affects part of the brain in charge of keeping memories. Since Irvin only recently started using a GF, he wasn't affected by their memory loss. BALAMB Garden is the only garden, mind you, that uses GFs, but Sylphie junctioned one when she was little, so this explains why she also had a memory lapse and couldn't remember where she grew up. This plot twist seemingly comes out of nowhere, and many fans have taken frustration with Final Fantasy VIII because of this. Until this point, nothing we've learned in the game ever hints at the use of GFs causing memory loss, making this plot twist seemingly come out of nowhere. The only mention of GFs causing memory loss is a study panel which you can access in the classroom at BALAMB Garden at any point in the game, but you're most likely just going to pass by this or not even check as you're trying to get your GFs. This began the annoying trend Final Fantasy would start with putting important plot details behind a database. If I'm being real, it's a pretty crap way to tell a story and contributes to many complaints I have about Final Fantasy XIII, 15, and 16. The only reason Final Fantasy VIII doesn't get so much hate for doing the same thing is because it's not as egregious as, say, some of those other aforementioned Final Fantasy games. There are some clues left within the game that hint at this you can find without having to access the panel. The first big hint comes from Elone when she calls Quistis Quisty in the training center. If you talk to the garden faculty before leaving for Timber, they will tell you to please ignore all complaints you hear about GFs. Irvin will also make a comment when he's recruited, saying perhaps it's fate. Elone also makes a comment to Squall about him not remembering her. These unfortunate things are not just enough to really give any context in any sort of big way. Sure, they're there, and when you go back and take a look at the breadcrumbs, you can definitely see some of the foreshadowing that was laid, but I feel it honestly just needed a little bit more, and there's a couple of areas that I feel they could have done this tremendously well. Instead of putting them in the study panel towards the beginning of the game, they simply could have taken a couple of minutes to throw in a couple sentences at the beginning of the game where Quistis could have mentioned it simply by stating that it was in the study panel, finishing up saying that it will be on next week's test, and then proceeding to tell the class that yes, GS have been speculated to have at the very least caused some sort of memory loss. The biggest missed opportunity, though, was during the assassination attempt on Edia. Instead of Irvin saying he tenses up every time he takes the shot and is unable to, it would have been better for him to just say that the sorceress raised him. Don't you remember, Squall? I feel just simply tweaking these lines would have made Final Fantasy VIII a much less divisive game when it came to the specific plot point in the story. Not to mention, amnesia had also been used in Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, so I feel like Final Fantasy fans at this point were like, okay, we get it. This is kind of a trope that Square Enix is going for. But to the JRPG trope back then, a lot of characters had amnesia. This was almost always a plot twist that characters would oftentimes use, or developers would oftentimes use, to make their characters completely oblivious what was going on to the world and use it as a way to kind of explain the world better to the character. This is a common trope in storytelling. For instance, Harry Potter also uses something similar where you have a character who really doesn't have anything or any knowledge of the wizarding world, but is able to learn and ask questions. Thus, Harry Potter is kind of the eyes in which we view the world of Harry Potter through. It's kind of the same trope that these characters tried to set up with Final Fantasy VIII, because in the eyes of a video game, it's easier to explain the story of what's going on to a player when the character is oblivious to what's going on. So this is oftentimes why this character trope was used so heavily in JRPGs. Speaking of information left inside of the menu, there's actually quite a bit you can find. For instance, if you take the time to go to just the regular menu in the game where you can pull up the junction menu and all of that, you can learn that Julia died in a car crash, which was why Rinoa had no mother. It also explains that the radio signals can't be used because the satellites are blocked for a reason that we don't know yet, and using the cables underground isn't a very reliable way for broadcasting anything either because the monsters destroy them. This explains why Final Fantasy VIII's world feels so modern, but yet that technology is rarely used. It's just a nice little world building thing that honestly would have kind of been cool to get just that little bit of lore or detail just mentioned somewhere in the dialogue besides the menus. The party begins to realize Sorceress Edia, Matron, the woman who raised them, that they will have to fight her in battle. After all, Seed's main goal is to defeat the sorceress. With the newly discovered information, the party makes the decision to return to the orphanage and visit their childhood home to jog their memory even further. However, sitting in the forest near the orphanage is Galbadia Garden. Approaching Galbadia Garden, BALAMB Garden gets ready to launch a full-scale assault against the sorceress. Squall lets the garden know that they are preparing for war. Making our way to the quad, Zell asks Squall for his ring, saying he thinks it's really cool and wants to make a copy of it. Okay, we're in the middle of a battle, this hardly feels like the time to ask for it, but Squall gives it to Zell anyways, and we move on. Soldiers have invaded the garden from all directions, and Squall has to think about his fellow party members, and Rinoa, who has fallen off a cliff when part of the garden snapped it back at the quad. The others are worried about her, but he also has the underclassmen who can't defend themselves. The party, worried about Rinoa hanging on for dear life, tells him that he needs to save her, that he's the only one who can, as if the others can't come up with a way to do it. It's clear the party is trying to hook Squall and Rinoa up, but they are acting childish. Squall is the only one in this segment who is actually thinking rationally. These are military soldiers, mercenaries, and yet they act like childish kids. In reality, they are, but ask any 18-year-old who served in a war, they're going to tell you this whole thing is poorly written. Jokes are fine. Charming moments of trying to get comrades together is fine, but not in the middle of an intense battle where tension is brewing. All this does is destroy any tension, and all tension the story or this moment is really trying to build up. Squall goes to rescue one of the younger classmen, and in doing so, he encounters a Galbadian soldier. After him and the Galbadian soldier go on a fight in a giant flying aircraft, Squall's able to take control of it and rescue Rinoa. Squall and Rinoa land in the garden and run past soldiers fighting, explosions happening, and comrades dying. Rinoa starts flirting with Squall. She tells him that she couldn't die, she had something of his she needed to give back. She reveals Zell gave her Squall's ring. She wanted a copy of it because she thought it looked cool. Rinoa asks Squall if the lion has a name, and he reveals it's Griever. This name will become relevant much later on. But let's talk what's going on here. I love Final Fantasy VIII. I do. I think it's a great game. I really, really do. But mere moments before this, we were just talking about how many of Final Fantasy VIII's characters break character. We now have Squall and Rinoa flirting in the middle on a battlefield. I get it, love on the battlefield, but it's extremely hard to take war seriously when characters are acting completely unfazed by what's just happened around them. They just walk past explosions and people dying. Seeing people you know die in combat traumatizes people. The explosions alone would have been enough to make their ears ring. I don't know what I'm supposed to be thinking right now. On one hand, it wants me to invest in this plot of this being a huge moment for Squall and Rinoa, drawing them closer. But at the same time, I'm supposed to get this feeling of that this is war. My blood's pumping, I'm ready to fight, only to have these few moments killed by these scenes. In contrast, this is happening during a battle, and it just seems so out of place. It's hard to take this interaction seriously between Squall and Rinoa. Some of Final Fantasy VIII storytelling is best taken when you don't take the plot seriously. But it's hard when you know that the writers, who have clearly demonstrated with other Final Fantasy games that they have the writing props to write scenes like this and time them accordingly. I have to be fair, but this whole battle scene just falls apart for me. It breaks that immersion and by default simply lowers the stakes the scene is trying to convey. There's no way around it other than to say this is some of the worst writing that I think the series has ever seen. Squall and Rinoa meet up with the remaining party members, and we make our way through Galbadia Garden to face the Sorceress once and for all. Sitting up top the garden, we face off against Cypher, still hell-bent on protecting Sorceress Edea. After a fight with Cypher, Edea disappears into the floor. It's time to finally confront Sorceress Edea herself. She's well aware we are the orphans that she raised as a child, but with no care in the world, she still decides to fight against the members of SEED, almost expecting that this day would come. Edea collapses to the ground after the fight, and Rinoa starts to walk as if she's under a trance. Walking over to Cypher, she whispers something in his ear before she collapses to the ground. When the party comes to, Edea seems to be caring, kind, and compassionate, a stark contrast to the sorceress that we've known thus far. Edea says she feared this day would come, as almost if she was expecting the party would fight her. She asks the party if they know if Elone's safe, if she succeeded in protecting her. Whatever has transpired here, it seems Edea has been put under some sort of spell. Quistis runs to Rinoa, who collapses to the floor. Unresponsive, Rinoa has entered a comatose state. Squall wakes up in his bed, wondering what happened to Rinoa. Whatever happened after the fight with Sorceress Edea knocked her out cold. Squall goes to the infirmary and just stares at Rinoa. Reality has finally set in for Squall. She's gone, unresponsive, and has begun to process his emotions. Squall gets a call from Quistis to head to the orphanage where Edea wants to talk to them. Upon entering the orphanage, Cid is reunited with his wife Edea. Cid expresses his regret and says he talks up a big game only to run away, stating, "He was just in a no-win situation. Your defeat would have been the end of you. Your victory would have meant losing his wife, a situation nobody ever wants to find themselves in." He seems relieved it worked out as well as he did. He only regrets using SEED, but what choice did he have? He only asked them to forgive Edea, not himself. Talking to Edea, it's clear she's no longer hostile, but she fears that she could be snapped back into that possessive state at any moment. She reveals she was possessed this entire time by a sorceress from the future named Ultimecia. Revealing Ultimecia was using her to find Elone and use her powers to go back to the past. Edea admits the only way she could protect Elone was to surrender her soul to Ultimecia, and let her have complete control. Galbadia believed that she was a sorceress that inherited Adele's power after the Sorceress War, but that wasn't the case. Edea had in fact received her powers at a very young age. Edea fears Adele is still alive, and the only reason Ultimecia gave up control of her body was to possess Adele's body. Sorceress Adele is known for stopping at nothing to pursue her own desires, fearing if Ultimecia gets a hold of Adele's body, The anger and hatred she has combined with Adele's desire would be catastrophic for the world. Squall is worried about Rinoa. His whole demeanor has shifted and it's the only thing he can focus on. His mind just isn't in it right now. Squall asks Edia if she knows what happened to Rinoa, but she hasn't a clue. Sid asks if Rinoa is dead. Squall abruptly shouts no, saying he understands how Squall feels, but he is in a position of leadership, and this isn't how a leader should be acting. That's rich coming from the guy who just told us he'd run away because you couldn't deal with the emotions of losing his own wife. It kinda shines on what an ass Sid actually is being. On one hand, I get where he's getting at. They just got out of a battle and the threat is more likely to get a lot more serious, especially if Sorceress Adele comes back. Squall needs to hear it, needed to know how a leader should act despite his personal feelings. I think Sid could have handled the situation much better though. Edia reveals Ultimecia wants Alone because she wants to perform time compression, and since Alone has the ability to send people's consciousness back to the past, she can go back far enough into the past and cast time compression spell, being able to use it to control past, present, and future. Meanwhile, Squall is having an inner dialogue with himself about Rinoa, recalling when they met and how she became unconscious. The party calls him out, saying they are worried about her too, but he needs to take this threat seriously. A lot of people complain about Squall's sudden change in personality, and we'll come back to this complaint in a little bit, because I actually have a lot to say. But let's take some time to address the way the party is actively acting towards Squall right now. Just a few scenes ago, the party was worried about Rinoa. They kept pressuring Squall into saving Rinoa, saying he was the only one who could, despite the fact that Squall had other people in the garden who he needed to take care of at the time. Squall was the only person in the party at the time acting like an actual leader, acting like an actual soldier. You also had the party trying to set Squall and Rinoa up during an actual all-out war. Nobody in that moment was taking anything seriously. Every party member at the moment was completely out of character. Now that Rinoa is okay, well, sort of okay, she's not in any imminent danger or falling to her death, now they decide to take things seriously? We're worried about Rinoa too, Squall. You need to take this seriously, Squall. You want to talk about a tonal shift. I find it much more infuriating how the party is acting at this time than any shift in personality Squall had in this short while. At least I can justify why Squall's personality shifted. Nothing about the way the party acted during the attack on BALAMB Garden now justifies anything to remotely act that way. I don't know if this was just an oversight of the event planners and different writers just not lining up, but it's a huge misstep on the writing team's part, and frankly, it just kills any emotion this scene and past scenes could have had. Squall visits Rinoa in the infirmary. He just wants to hear her voice and begins to miss her infectious personality, realizing she made him happy. Sure, she was annoying, but having her around brought him so much joy. Before he can get lost too much in his thoughts though, Squall collapses on the side of the bed next to Rinoa, and we are thrown into another dream sequence with Laguna, Kiros, and Ward. They find themselves in the mountains looking to make money for their travels. Laguna takes up a role playing the lead of a movie about a sorceress and her knight. They film the scene of them fighting a dragon, which Kiros and Ward were supposed to dress up as, but a real ruby dragon appears, causing the director to run off. After a fight with the ruby dragon, we see lunatic Pandora off in the distance. Laguna finds himself talking to Matron while looking for a young Alone. She was kidnapped by Esthar soldiers. Adele is looking for someone to pass her powers onto, and she has chosen Alone to receive them. Laguna expresses he wants to hear Alone's voice again, with Squall interjecting his own thoughts saying he wants to hear Rinoa's voice again. This sparks the idea that he could use Alone's ability to send someone's consciousness back into the past so he could warn Rinoa about what was going to happen and stop her from entering a comatose state. We need to find a way to the White Seed ship though, but before we move on, I do want to point something out. Cypher told us of his romantic dream of wanting to become a sorceress's knight. This was something since childhood he wanted to aspire to after watching a movie during his childhood. This movie was the exact same one Laguna was just in. Cypher's victory pose, how he holds his gunblade in battle, and aligns with the movements and victory pose of Laguna during this scene. Final Fantasy VIII does some incredibly cool things here, using subtle hints to elaborate on Cypher's character and also draw attention to small irrelevant details we didn't need to know, but it adds depth to the story. And honestly, if I have to be honest, I feel like doing this adds so much character and detail to the world without having to destroy the pace. We stop by the orphanage to talk to Edia to ask her about the location of the White Seed ship. She says they don't stay in one place for too long because it's their job to protect alone, but they have been favoring the landscape of Centra recently. She gives us a letter to show to the captain of the ship so we can come aboard without any problems. Hopping aboard the White Seed ship, they are hesitant to let us on board. Squall tells them Edia isn't being controlled anymore, but they have no reason to believe him, especially since they are looking to protect Elone from Ultimecia. Zone and Watts are also aboard the ship. Zone asks Rinoa if he is okay, and Squall tells them what happened. Zone is fierce with Squall and begins yelling at him. Watts calms him down though, ensuring Zone that Rinoa isn't dead, just asleep. Speaking to the leader, we can show him the letter and he tells us Elone is not there. They were engaged in a battle with Galbadian forces. They were able to escape, but their ship broke down recently. It wasn't long after Esthar's soldiers showed up and Elone jumped onto their ship. With Elone and Esthar, we need to find a way to get to this mysterious city that's hidden itself from the world. There is a small exchange I missed during this playthrough, and you can go to the seed ship to get it and get some more information regarding the origins of the god Hein. If we talk to an NPC on the ship, she tells us this story. Once upon a time, there was a person named Hein. Hein was the ruler of the world. He became lazy and decided to make a tool to make his life easier. Hein made a neat tool. His tool could make more tools by itself. Soon there were lots of tools in the world. These tools were actually people. When Hein woke up, he was surprised because there were a lot of people. Hein wanted to reduce the number of people and use magic to burn up a lot of small people. The small people were children. The people cherished the children very much, so people rebelled against Hein. Hein used powerful magic to fight them. The people couldn't use magic, but they had wisdom. Eventually, Hein began to lose the war because there were too many people to fight, and they were getting smarter. Therefore, he decided to make peace with the people by offering them half of his body along with his powers. Hein cut his body in half and gave the people half as he promised. Then another war started. People began to fight over the power Hein offered them through his body. This war lasted decades. Finally, King Zelbaga and the Zelbaga tribe emerged victorious and demanded Hein's body half to get its powers, but the body ignored their commands. Then Vaskaroon came to their rescue. He appeared before the confused Zelbagas and revealed to them that Hein's body half was corrupted and possessed no real power. The half body was actually Hein's cast-off skin. The Zelbagas were angered by the truth and decided to destroy Hein. The Zelbagas never found Hein. People began to call him Hein the Magician and continued to hunt for him for centuries to come. Something I enjoy about Final Fantasy VIII, and a lot of complaints people have with it, is how its lore and description of Hein is shrouded in mystery. But I really get what they were trying to do here is resembling of our own myths and mythology. Final Fantasy VIII was a game we weren't supposed to understand. It wasn't a game we were supposed to know every little world detail and mythology that went into it. Nor do I think they really thought it out too far when developing the game. In a lot of ways, the mystery surrounding Hein and who Hein was and what the purpose of Hein was left shrouded in mystery because it is meant to reflect our own world. How a lot of the history that we think we know may not in fact be true. And if you've taken a look at any recent structures or archaeological finds or videos, you start to realize that the world may have been connected far more than we actually thought they were. This can all kind of go back to how all mythologies have a common theme. How mankind was created by quote-unquote God, and the world was populated and shifted, and then something happened before the worldwide flood that caused God to wipe them out. It's kind of the same concept Final Fantasy VIII tries to build. It leaves that ancient mythology, that story, kind of up for interpretation. Is it true? Possibly. Did Hein exist? Potentially. But it's not really something I think that we are ever meant to truly know. I have my own theories we're going to discuss at the end of this video on what I think Hein was and what actually happened. But we'll get more into that when we analyzed Final Fantasy VIII and tried to piece together some of the story elements to try to figure out what is going on. Heading to Fisherman's Horizon, we can use old train tracks to get there to Esthar. Squall grabs Rinoa from the infirmary and carries her down the tracks. He begins to inner monologue again, laying his feelings out for Rinoa. Squall realizes he has changed his life a lot. His hesitancy to let people in has shifted since meeting Rinoa. Squall's defenses he built up his entire life are slowly being torn down. Squall admits he always cared too much about what people thought of him. It was just easier if he was an introvert and didn't socialize much. It was easier for him to deal with that than losing friends. He lost his sister figure alone and wanted to be strong. People perceived him as strong. Opening up and showing vulnerabilities made him look weak. He thought by relying on others they would think of him differently, seeing him as weak. Let's address the Squall controversy about the sudden change in personality. Many criticize Squall from having a tonal shift too quick, but really this has been happening since the beginning of the game. Rinoa has been trying to reach Squall since the very beginning, since they met all the way back at that ball. She always liked Squall. I talked earlier about how Squall could come off cold and how they likely shaped people's opinion of Squall coming off as an ass. But go for the more lighthearted options, these changes begin to make sense. Squall didn't realize how much she loved Rinoa until she was threatened with the possibility of her being dead. That loneliness began to sink in. Rinoa was the first one whom began to open up, if but just a little, those romantic feelings that Squall began to show. I can relate to this quite a bit. I too tend to have a hard time letting people in. I spent my life building up those defenses and refusing to let people in. Outside of my family, I really didn't like opening up. I've lost many friends, was made fun of for being vulnerable. My trust had been destroyed. It wasn't really until I met my wife I began to feel these changes too. Annoying elements of her personality became endearing. Her infectious personality began to wear at my defenses. My whole personality began to shift. It wasn't about me, it was about someone else. This happened rather quickly too. When she started paying attention to me, I felt myself, I needed it. I felt a feeling of comfort I'd never felt before. Being an introvert myself, his progression just always seemed normal to me. When she is gone, he begins to realize just how much she has had an effect on him. I think this goes for any introverted person. We don't like to be left alone, but it's hard to let people in when you're hurt or wronged in so many times. We've seen throughout the course of the game Squall's personality shift, especially if you've decided to pick those more lighthearted options when reacting to Rinoa. If you took Rinoa to the garden during the missile-based segment, then you get those interactions that even deepen the relationship between Squall and Rinoa. But even if you do take her to the missile base, Squall can reply that he missed Rinoa as well. So there are feelings Squall is already showing for Rinoa, and these small little details are oftentimes missed by so many players who try to nitpick at this game's story. And it's not to say the writing is perfect, because it's not. We've gone through detail of how the characters oftentimes feel like they are mismanaged or out of character, but I do feel throughout the game Squall is consistently the one who remains in character the entire game. And when you start to peel back and piece together why Squall feels the way that he does, it all starts to make sense. It starts to click, and then all of a sudden, Squall's abrasive personality shift doesn't feel so abrasive anymore. Squall is divisive because some people can't relate with him, while others get him because they are him. They understand him perfectly. Honestly, Squall was how I based myself throughout most high school, and even after. I've opened up a bit more, but I still have some of those defenses in place and likely always will. I fear they could come crumbling down at any moment. Sorceress Edia wants to join us going to Esthar to visit Dr. Odine, to see if he can help her resist Ultimisha's control for good. We make our way through the Great Salt Lake and find an entrance to Esthar. It's unlike any city we've seen thus far. Their technology is leagues ahead of anything we've seen up until this moment. It looks like a city ripped straight out of the future. Before we can make it too far though, Elone sends our consciousness back to the past once again. Laguna, Kiros, and Ward find themselves locked up somewhere in Esthar. Laguna works in the basement of Dr. Odine's lab alongside another human and a Moomba, one of the same creatures from Desert Prison. Laguna shows the Moomba a great deal of respect, which is more than what most people have probably done. This explains why the Moombas took such a liking to Laguna. Laguna and the Moomba are stuck behind. The Esthar guard tells Laguna and the Moomba they need to stay behind with no mill for the day since they haven't worked hard enough. The other man working with Laguna is part of the resistance. He tells Laguna he would make a good leader for the resistance. Many people are dissatisfied with Adele's rule. The guard gets pissed he isn't working and following the commands he just gave him, and we are instantly thrown into a fight. Kiros and Ward join the next battle. Planning an escape, they make their way to the elevator into Odine's lab. Odine's assistance is also part of the resistance. Dr. Odine has taken a recent interest in Alone and her mysterious power. Learning Odine may know the location of Alone, he decides to go back and talk to him. Laguna finds the location of Alone and the two of them are reunited. Afterwards, the party wakes up and a car pulls them up, taking them to Odine's lab. Edia explains she wants Odine to stop the sorceress from being able to take over her again. Odine agrees to help and takes Squall to Alone, but he wants to study Renoa. Squall isn't happy about this, but with a little pressure from Edia, he agrees to let Odine do so. Odine's aide tells us to go to Lunar Gate if we want to find Alone. They will load her into a pod at Lunar Gate once Odine is done examining her. Squall is walked through the process of how going to outer space will work. Squall and another party member will be able to go. I chose Selphie to go with me for this round. The other party members are left with Zell to protect Edia. Control shifts to Zell as lunatic Pandora arises from the ocean and makes its way to Tearpoint in Esthar. If it makes its way to Tearpoint, the Lunar Cry will be summoned. What is Ultimecia planning? Heading back to Odine's lab, we get a debriefing on the path lunatic Pandora will take. It's decided we will enter lunatic Pandora and put a stop to it. Heading to one of the cross points, we can jump into lunatic Pandora and make our way through, only to be ejected by a machine guard inside. With no way to stop lunatic Pandora, it makes its way to Tearpoint, and preparations for the Lunar Cry begin to proceed. Squall arrives at Lunar Base where they take Renoa into the infirmary to keep her safe and monitor her. On the Lunar Base, we get a glimpse of the moon and we can see monsters on the moon gathering in one place, in preparation for the Lunar Cry. Squall makes his way to another room to see Alone and asks her if she can take him back to the past to warn Renoa. Alone doesn't really seem to know Renoa though, and only reveals she is able to send people back she knows. Alone apologizes for using them to go back to the past, realizing that she can't change it, but was able to see just how much she was loved, and that brought warmth to her heart. Honestly, this whole sequence with Alone sets up the themes of Final Fantasy VIII and ties heavily into the time compression that Ultimecia wants to achieve, already stating the events that Ultimecia is not going to be able to change her goal, because you can't go back to the past and change things that have already happened. We take Alone to the infirmary, but before we make our way to it, Renoa awakens in a trance-like state and begins walking towards the sill to Adele's tomb. Yes, Sorceress Adele is located in outer space. Renoa makes her way to the main bridge of the Lunar Base and hits the switch to unlock Adele's tomb. The second sill is on Adele's tomb herself, meaning Renoa is going to have to go into outer space in order to unlock it. It seems Edia's hunch was correct. Renoa throws on a spacesuit and prepares to make her way to Adele's tomb to release the second sill. The Lunar Cry has positioned perfectly to knock down Adele's tomb with her and bring her back down to Earth. Renoa releases that final sill on Adele's tomb, and the Lunar Cry starts to knock Adele down with it. Renoa is left to float in outer space alone. Aboard the escape pod from Lunar Base, Alone is able to send Squall back into the past of Renoa. Renoa and Irvine are driving a car and taking Renoa back to her father. This must have been at the time of the desert prison. Renoa wanted Irvine to go back and rescue the rest of the party from desert prison. Renoa is able to convince Irvine after scratching him to death to do so. The next scene we see is with Zell and Renoa having an exchange over Squall's ring and how she would like a copy of it, eventually convincing Zell to try and ask Squall to give it to him. Alone takes us back to the point where Renoa collapsed. Ultimecia has been controlling Renoa and Cypher telling him to go find lunatic Pandora and rise it from the depths of the ocean. Once Squall makes his way back to the present, the scene shifts to Rinoa in outer space, continually drifting. Her life support has run out. Though feeling Squall's presence, Rinoa is able to hit the backup life support, but it's not going to buy her much time. A worried Squall, knowing he can't waste any more time, makes his way out of the escape pod into outer space to catch Rinoa as she drifts. Real fear sets in as Squall realizes they might die in space together. But one of the ships used to launch Adele's tomb into outer space floats into orbit, and Squall and Rinoa are able to make their way onto it. Talk about Deus Ex Machina and a ship just conveniently appearing out of nowhere. This ship is called the Ragnarok, and it is by far my favorite airship in the entire video game series. Shaped like a dragon, Rinoa wants Squall to hug her, but the urge to do so is kinda gone since the spacesuit was in the way earlier. Inside the Ragnarok, however, there are these creatures we must kill. There is a trick to killing them. The color of the monsters matter. In order for them to remain dead, we must kill the same color right after fighting the other. So let's say we kill red, we'll need to defeat the other red one in order to kill both so they remain dead. After their defeat, Squall is able to get a hold of an Esthar air station, and they're able to pilot the ship back down to Earth, turning on the autopilot. Rinoa reveals she is a sorceress after the fight with Edea. Her powers were transferred to Rinoa. This was why she was able to be controlled by Ultimecia. Rinoa will need to be locked up as they make their way back down to Earth. But it doesn't stop Squall and Rinoa from sharing a heartfelt moment in the cockpit of the Ragnarok. Squall and Rinoa talk, finally getting that romantic Eyes on Me playing in the background. I've heard over the years some complaints of Eyes on Me and how it doesn't fit them, but something you got to realize was the song was written about Laguna by Julia, Rinoa's mother. While Julia and Laguna were not able to fall in love, their kids were, so it is nice to see that romantic nod of what was and eventually romance carrying on into their children. Once they arrive on Earth, Squall and Rinoa say goodbye as Rinoa is taken to the Sorceress Memorial to be locked up for her safety in the safety of the world. After all, she did unlock Adele's tomb. The rest of the party boards the Ragnarok, and Quistis ridicules Squall for giving Rinoa up that easily after going through all that trouble to save her. It's decided they are going to break Rinoa out of prison. The engineers are not happy with this, but Squall and the party force their way through. Squall cuts the tube, putting her into cryosleep, and catches her as she falls out of the tomb, finally embracing Rinoa in his arms. I'm pretty sure this scene was more or less thrown in to actually get a big hug moment for Squall and Rinoa. It needed to be after Squall rescued her, and since the spacesuits were in the way, I think this is how they chose to do it here. We're finally able to roam the world freely and revisit any location we want. So previously inaccessible locations have now become available. We can make our way to the Deep Sea Research Center and acquire Bahamut. We can also defeat Ultima Weapon and draw the most powerful summon, Eden, from it. We can also make our way to Cactar Island, defeat the giant Cactar, and get the GF Cactar. I also made my way to Central Ruins to acquire Odin and the Tonberry GF. We can also go to Shumi Village, which technically we could have done early with BALAMB Garden, but now's as good of time as any. Here we can acquire the GF Phoenix by collecting stones and learning a bit more about Shumi and their culture. If you recall, Norg was a Shumi. The Shumi are able to evolve into whatever they want through how they live their life. Some become elders while others become Moombas. Think of the Shumi culture kind of much like Buddhism or Hinduism, that sort of culture that comes from India. This is clearly what they were trying to play as, and it feels almost as if like reaching Moomba is kind of like their state of reaching nirvana and just inner peace. At least that's the way that I drew a conclusion from it. I am not super familiar with India's culture or Hinduism and how Buddhism works, but I can definitely see the parallels to Buddhism specifically within Shumi Village and how their enlightenment and finding inner peace definitely works. On a side note, it also kind of reflects this more because Shumi tribes tend to achieve that enlightenment, find inner peace, and live one with the world, live in the moment. You know, exist within just existence alone. Whereas Norg ended up being greedy. He sought after money. He had become corrupted by the world and the material things within it. So again, their culture fits very heavily into this idea of enlightenment and nirvana, and I think that's kind of a cool nod to what otherwise fits into the themes of Final Fantasy, right? It's not worrying about the past. It's not worrying about the future. It's not worrying about what's going to become. It's about living in the present, in the moment now, and just being one with existence. It's really hitting home this message that no matter how hard you try, you cannot return to the past. No matter how much you worry about the past and things that happen within the past, who shaped you into who you are, you have to be able to heal that trauma in order to just simply exist. And then only once you free yourself from the burdens of the past and worrying about the future, Final Fantasy VIII really does feel like a culmination of working through your mental problems and living in the moment then and now. And only when you realize that about yourself are you able to achieve great things. It's time for the final mission, so we can make our way to the presidential residency. It turns out Laguna is president of Esthar, and we can press him on a few things to find out how. He talks about leaving Rain to look for Elone and how he wished he could have gone back and made his way, but Rain died quite a while ago. It pains him so much to talk about it that he doesn't say much more. It's shortly after childbirth that she passed away. We also press Laguna for some information on Adele and how he became president. He reveals shortly after joining the resistance, they lured Adele into a trap by creating an illusion of Elone that she was stuck in cryo. Adele didn't fall for it, but it gave Laguna a chance to push her into the memorial just enough to get her sucked in and froze her in cryosleep, thus being able to launch her into outer space. They sunk lunatic Pandora into the ground, and he took the role of president since Esthar needed a new leader with Adele gone. If you've wondered why the TVs and radio signals in Final Fantasy VIII never worked, this was why. 17 years ago, that was all given up, almost as a sacrifice, if you will, to ensure the world was safe from Adele. Her tomb blocked the signals, but was still very much alive. Even all the way back in Timber, there were words on the screen coming from Adele, and if you look closely, you can make out those words, which read, "I'm still alive, and I will never let you forget me." So Adele was alive and well this entire time. We can later talk to Laguna, Kiros, and Ward on the Ragnarok for some extra dialogue, but we will cover it here. It's not really a mystery at this point, but Laguna is Squall's father, and Rain his mother. It was shortly after his birth that him and Elone were taken to the orphanage. Talking to Laguna, he says we have things we need to talk about after these events are over. Talking to Kiros, he does mention how much he looks like his mother, and talking to Ward, Kiros translates saying it's a good thing he doesn't look like his father, insinuating the idea that yes, Squall is the son of Laguna. If that's still not enough to convince you that Squall is indeed the son of Laguna, let's talk about another small hint given all the way back in Desert Prison when the Moombas are surrounding Squall, and they continually repeat Laguna. Make no mistake, they either thought he looked enough like Laguna or felt a connection between the two, because remember, Laguna, as we just mentioned shortly ago, had a very strong connection with the Moombas due to the time that he spent in Shumi Village, and as well as how he treated the Moomba, specifically in Esthar. So that little connection there, amongst some other things, can really draw that conclusion home that yes, indeed, Squall is the son of Laguna. Let's take some time real quick to talk about Triple Triad specifically, because while I didn't do much of it this round, I'm actually going to pull a clip from my old retrospective that I did on Final Fantasy VIII, which I will not delist, I will keep up, talking specifically about Triple Triad, because it plays so heavily into the way that we can attain items to level up our characters, as well as just is a major part of Final Fantasy VIII. And a lot of people thoroughly enjoy Triple Triad, so I think it is important here to place that clip from that old video and explain how Triple Triad works. I decided for the sake of this retrospective to take a plunge into Triple Triad, set aside my biases, and give it an honest shot. What did I discover? I honestly liked Triple Triad quite a bit more than Tetra Master. Triple Triad is pretty simple to figure out. Your cards will have letters and numbers indicating how strong your card actually is. The higher the number that your opponent's, you will overtake the card by flipping it to your own color. With strategies and placements and paying attention to your opponent's moves, you'll achieve victory. Triple Triad really shines in how it changes the rules depending on the region of the world you're in. This makes the game really exciting and made me rethink my strategy a lot. So let's talk about these different rules and how they affect the game. First off, let's talk about the rules one and all. One will give you one card of your picking if victory is ensured. If you are playing with all, which I pretty much always recommend you should, just for card mod alone, make sure you save often, because like you're able to take every card your opponent has, they're able to take every card you have in your hand. Next up, let's talk about Elemental and Same. Elemental will place specific elemental icons on the board. So say you've got a card with a fire element, placing that card on a fire icon gives the card a +1 on all 4 sides, meaning each number is increased by 1. While on the other hand, if you put a card on the icon that doesn't have an element or isn't the right element, you'll lose the value to each number on the card, making it weaker. Same will flip cards over if the player card has an equal value to the side the card is being played. There are variations of these rules and adding a bit more depth to the card game. The last rule I do want to mention though is open and random. Open will show you your opponent's cards, allowing you to better strategize your moves. If open is not played, all cards will be flipped and won't be revealed until they are played. Random will select cards out of your deck at random. This is the rule I found myself hating the most. Laguna wants Seed to help them defeat Adele and Ultimecia by using Elone's powers to send their consciousness back into the past, so Ultimecia can travel back to the past and cast time compression, combining the past, present, and future to give her what she wants, but allows an opportunity to travel to her castle and defeat her. Ultimecia is only able to travel to this time because of the finding of an old machine created by Odin, which used Elone's powers, which he called Junction Machine Elone. Laguna says in order for this to work and make their way back to the present, they need something to anchor themselves to. The rest of the party have each other, but Squall is the only one who is going to struggle with this. They go back to the orphanage to find a connection. Squall and Rinoa have some alone time to talk a bit, and Rinoa says that they will meet here in the Field of Flowers. This was the cryptic message given back at the very beginning cinematic of the game. We make our way to Lunatic Pandora, bust through the shield with the Ragnarok, and encounter Cypher in one last battle. This battle with Cypher, Odin will be summoned if we have him, and Cypher will split him into 2. Gilgamesh will appear, grabbing Odin's sword. After the fight with Cypher, Fujin and Rajan abandon Cypher. They can't continue to support him down this path. They are tired of watching him be used by the sorceress. They call him pathetic, but it doesn't stop him from kidnapping Rinoa and taking her to Sorceress Adele. It seems Cypher is just a lost cause at this point. Encountering Sorceress Adele, we fight her in battle as she junctions Rinoa, and will need to boggle not killing her in the process fighting Adele. Just a side note here, Adele is freaking massive. Like, we saw from the cutscenes how tall Adele is, but this battle really cements how much of a monster that Adele is compared to others. I don't know anything about the past of Adele, and honestly, I feel like out of anything, I want to know more about Adele specifically. It's just kind of a shame that we never really got to see Laguna's story, perhaps because some of that might have given us some details about Adele's past, where she came from, and it would have been cool to actually find out. After a fight with Adele, Elone and Laguna appear to enact the earlier mentioned plan and send Rinoa, Ultimecia, and Adele into the past so Ultimecia can use time compression and allow the party to travel to the future to defeat her once and for all. Once we arrive at Ultimecia's castle, our powers will be locked, and we'll need to defeat all of her guardians in order to unlock all of our functions. Limit breaks, summons, savings, items, resurrection, you name it, it will all be unlocked. And once we have defeated all the guardians, we can make our way to confront Ultimecia. It is also worth noting that we can summon the ultimate boss in the game, this being Omega Weapon. But I don't know anybody without Game Shark who has actually beaten Ultima Weapon. He is an extremely hard boss to fight, and if I'm not mistaken, a lot of people do put him up as one of the most challenging ultimate bosses in the entire franchise. It's finally time to have our showdown with Ultimecia. She despises Seed. She's been fighting them for a long time. She will pick party members at random as we engage in a fight. Eventually, she will summon the ultimate GF Griever, aptly named after Squall's lion. This isn't really explained, but perhaps Griever is a GF Squall was aware about but never able to obtain. After junctioning herself with Griever and defeating her, we see her final form, Ultimecia dangling from below and a glowing light fighting on a giant cape in space. I kind of wonder if this was Hein. I might be completely wrong, but it kind of makes sense. Hein gave his body up, and the power of the sorceress was passed down through a line of women, with the women receiving the power of the sorceress. It makes me curious if Ultimecia's power dated back to the first sorceress, and that began how somehow time compression upon completion was supposed to give Hein all of the sorceress's powers from all across time, making him whole once again. In some ways, I kinda think this makes sense, and it plays heavily into the theme of Final Fantasy VIII. In order to make it back to the past, one must anchor themselves into the present. Or, well, the present really, them going back from Ultimecia's future back into the past is basically what I'm saying. Laguna said as much, and this was how, in order that was going to play out, that they had to have something to anchor themselves to the then and now. Ultimecia, or Hein, is hell-bent on attaining oneself by focusing on the past, present, and future. If you want to obtain true enlightenment, inner peace, you have to focus on the then and now. You have to focus on the then and now, not the past or the future. Once Ultimecia is defeated, her time compression spell is cast and it fails, and the party is able to make their way back to the present. Squall and Ultimecia travel back to the past where they were but children, and Squall sees Matron and a younger him. She knows who he is and realizes he doesn't belong in this time. Adia, realizing what's going on with Ultimecia, realizes she needs to pass on her powers in order for her to die and gladly accepts them. Squall tells her that Sorceress Adia is from the future and that she will possess her in order to cast a time compression spell. He tells her to start up a school in which they'll fight the sorceress and eventually lead to her defeat. Yep, Squall was the catalyst for all of this. Ultimecia sealed her own fate by keeping this miserable time loop in place. Final Fantasy VIII is all to say you can't change the past no matter how hard you try. Your life is indeed fated to happen and you can't change that. Squall desperately continues to find a way into the present but really struggles to try to focus on Rinoa's face, but no matter what he does, he can't do it. He eventually gives up hope and sees Rinoa's helmet from space break open, collapsing. I think there's some confusion to what's going on here. Squall being lost to time ceasing to exist, which is why he collapsed. It wasn't a broken heart that almost killed him, it was Rinoa's strong will that called her to Squall and saved him, thus the Fill the Flowers appearing, indicating that they'd made it back to the present. Remember, Squall didn't like getting close to people, but it was those bonds that would call him back to the past. Squall was the only one who struggled with this fear of losing them again, particularly Rinoa. It makes sense for his arc to go full circle by trying really hard and only struggling, only to be called back by Rinoa, whom he wasn't willing to give up on, therefore she wasn't willing to give up on him, cementing he needs his friends and companions to rely on to get through life. With the credits rolling, we get a glimpse of Eddie and Sid finally reuniting in the garden, Zell getting a chance to eat a hot dog, selfie recording and wearing Irvine's hat, all peaceful at BALAMB Garden. The final scene shows Squall and Rinoa alive and well with the camera zooming in and Squall and Rinoa leaning in to kiss each other, with Squall smiling for the first time in the game. I love Final Fantasy VIII's ending. I'm not always one that needs a happy ending, but we got one, and it also wraps it up very nicely. It was a nice contrast to Final Fantasy VII, which kinda left the ending ambiguous. We never really got a chance to see what happened to the party members in Final Fantasy VII until we got Advent Children and the rest of the compilation years later. At the end of Final Fantasy VIII, it always does feel good for a game about friendship and connections. Final Fantasy VIII may not have the strongest narrative or theme as message as powerful as other entries, but it doesn't mean it isn't good, nor that it isn't deep. And as we are about to discover, there was a great deal of mythology that inspired Final Fantasy VIII. Before we get into that though, let's take a look at this passage from the Ultimania that elaborates just a little bit more on the legend of Hein. Good morning. Well, today's a Tale of Witches Day. To be clear, this won't be on the test, so those of you who want to ignore the teacher will be alright. If you study something else, that's fine. I think this knowledge of witch stuff will be interesting to all of you, though it involves real magic. Also, the witch story is one of your teacher's personal likes, very much, so please try to maintain your attention and lend me your ear for a little while. Well, let's begin. First, when talking about witches, there's text that can't be left out. I'll read it. At the time, daylight had not yet come and everything was covered in night. There was a being called Hein. Hein created the world and battled many beasts all the while. Because of the magic Hein used, he was able to win battles with his powers. Eventually, thus, Hein was governor of this land. Hein seated himself upon the throne, from where he thought he could see all around. However, from the location of his throne, Hein was unable to view the eastern sea because of a mountain. Because of his long battles, Hein had become too tired to destroy the mountain and needed a tool to carve it up. He had an idea of what would apply this task. This tool would be used to function of his own accord and be able to increase its own numbers. Hein named these tools humans. The males and females are the origins of human beings, and we descend from them. The human beings increased their number while carving up the mountain. When their work was finished, they decided to ask Hein what they should do next. However, Hein was sound asleep due to his fatigue. There was nothing they could do about it. The humans began to change the land to their own discretion. When Hein awoke, the appearance of the era had completely changed. He was most startled, though, by the number of human beings that there were now. Hein decided to reduce the number of human beings and use magic to burn up smaller humans. The small human beings were called children, and they were very important to the humans. They wept intensely in protest to Hein. However, he told them that they were his tools, and his words angered them. They cursed his words when they heard them. The humans began a rebellion against Hein. He retaliated with his magic, but the humans were able to increase their numbers in abundance. Besieged, Hein bargained with the humans. He offered them half of his own body and power. At the idea of having half of his power, the humans decided they should agree to the deal. Hein split his body in half and gave half to the humans. With the peace was drawn between them, Hein and humans, however, humans began to quarrel with one another for the first time. Coming together in groups, they wanted the power of half of Hein's body. Long, long ago, a battle began. Many countries were established at this time. The battle was eventually won by a clan of the Dark King Zelbaga. With the forest, they convened in to command the power of the half of Hein's body. However, the half of Hein's body was unresponsive to their commands. Sage Vascaroon came to consult Zelbaga. He was wise and knew the answer to the problem with the half of Hein's body. Hein had given them a corrupted part of his body. What the humans had thought was half of Hein's body was really just a cast-off of Hein. When they heard this explanation, Zelbagas' clan was furious. They vowed to destroy Hein. However, the other half of Hein's body was nowhere to be found. The humans began referring to the missing Hein as Hein the Magician and sought him for generations. This text comes from those claims to have been descended from Sage Vascaroon, and is part of the compilation The Legend of Vascaroon. As this part, it talks about Vascaroon's many inventions and great achievements, but Hein doesn't appear again. Must be due to the other authors forgetting midway, huh? Ah, what a shame, of course. This is folklore and can't be verified by science. Even now, the author can only be speculated. It's probably arose from those various stories of the time being combined. If you believe this book, Sage Vascaroon lived 980 years. That's strange, right? Yeah, was Sage Vascaroon telling the truth about Hein's magic? Well, it's impossible to prove, so even if you advocate this theory, you shouldn't teach high school students to believe in it, huh? Well, there are people who believe the magic of Hein is the origin of the witches. Witches actually exist. There are various studies into their origins, but your teacher likes the magic of Hein equals witch theory, yes? That is also it, isn't it? It's impossible to demand the origins of folklore, but this didn't come from zero. Just as life didn't come from nothing. Therefore, I think there's a bit of truth, even in legend. No, I guess you could say I hope so. Let's change the subject, shall we? Let me introduce you to the theory of magic of Hein equals witches theory. Well, the word witch, as commonly used, was designed by the scholar Temu around 500 years ago. Temu combined folklore, legends, and known facts and referred to the historical scholars by story writers. Because of that, this Temu, out of respect for his resolve, such a strange, daring scholar. Temu recorded his own work, The Whereabouts of Hein. It is to be expected that the magic of Hein could not be found because of the people's feelings at that time. It concealed itself in bodies, in the form of women, people who thought that they should be protected. Occasionally women played important roles in history, but I think this was just the magic of Hein, whether it be a descendant of individuals who are in control or the magic of Hein itself, which made it clear in future research. The magic of Hein in the form of women. I named those witches. What does this explanation entail? You might say it has a negative connotation, which certainly has a simple persuasive power, right? There is no evidence of what Temu asserted, still including it though. What's to become of the cast-off skin of Hein? You can discuss that for classwork. This is very, very interesting. You can acquire about the name of geology classwork, right? We're getting off on the lesson plan, aren't we? So let's return to the tale of witches. Lately, witches have been involved in more historical events. Current witches, historical witches, there have been many witches. So it's not clear how many existed. This is part of why they were considered a problem. Basically, witches hide themselves from society. Even though Dr. Katawaki understands witches, doesn't everyone? Generally, it has been a greeting up until now. It has been, hasn't it? However, such people don't exist. Yet, even part of the witches, that's one of a problem. There haven't been many witches who have abused the power of their magic. Oh, to bring things up with the opportunity for us, why is it that everyone has such an interest in witches? Is there enough of you? I could make a witch research club. Okay, let's return to the main subject. Historically, there have been 3 important witches. Some time ago, I mentioned them and their names will be on the test. One witch said to have been in ancient times, which stood up for the sake of the people in a country at the time of collapse. A movie was made about her with the knight Zephyr. I think a lot of people have probably seen it. Next is the witch who divided the world in the time of the Sorceress' War. This was a terrible witch. This is clearly Adele. And those who were most familiar to us, yes, the witch that cooperated in the research of magical mechanics. Thanks to everyone, we can now use magic. This, of course, being Edia. That time already, your teacher has talked herself to a day, squandered our available time. It can't be helped, so have a good day, prepare your memory for the names of the 3 witches. We'll see you tomorrow. There are some similarities to the story of the Tower of Babel and the concept of humans spreading across different countries, starting up their own empires, eventually fighting each other to gain power over each other. It's really meant to reflect the vicious cycle of war that ensues since the beginning of time. One of the complaints levied against Final Fantasy VIII's plot, and we've touched upon how the major plot twist seemingly pops up out of nowhere without any explanation or reason for many of the events that happen during the game. There is a reason such theories about Squall is dead and Ultimecia Renoa are so prominently discussed among the fanbase, both of which we may be looking at later on. Ultimecia makes for a great final boss, but let's be honest, her presence really does come out of nowhere. If we take a look at some of Final Fantasy VIII's lesser-known lore and apply some real-world mythology to it, I think we can shed some light on this mystery. For starters, let's take a look at some of the clues Kitase has left us. Final Fantasy VIII borrows heavily from European architecture. Delling City was based off of Paris, while Centra ruins were based off of Greco-Roman agriculture. Dollet City and Esthar were remnants of the Centra Empire. What does Greek and Roman have to do with Ultimecia, though? Well, much like Rome, Centra is a fallen empire. Let's keep this in mind. We'll be returning to this in a moment as the Roman Empire becomes very important in piecing Final Fantasy VIII's puzzle together. Ultimecia is actually translated incorrectly. There are a couple reasons for this. I will link a video in the cards explaining why this happened. It's worth a watch if you are at all curious. The TLDR, Ultimecia's name should have been translated to Artemisia. The name Artemisia will likely ring a bell for anyone who has watched the 300 sequel, if you remember Eva Green's character, Artemisia of Caria. She was the queen of the Greek city of Halicarnassus. There was one prominent woman in history with the same name, this being Artemisia of Caria too, and it's likely both contributed a great deal to the character of Ultimecia. So let's take a look more depth into the historical figures who both ruled over the city of Halicarnassus. Artemisia of Caria was first a Persian general who fought along the Persian king Xerxes during Persia's invasion of Greece. Under the command of Xerxes, Artemisia commanded an army of 5 ships. While Ultimecia didn't serve as a king, she herself did become a competent ruler and eventually went on to lead the Galbadian War through the use of Edia. Though there are some parallels with Artemisia of Caria I, she however resembles Artemisia of Caria II far more. Artemisia of Caria was a general to her husband, brother, Mausolus. After the death of Mausolus, Artemisia took this extremely hard. She would often consume the ashes of her late husband. Artemisia took the throne after her husband's death and constructed a giant mausoleum in his name, which would later go on to be known as the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. The mausoleum was represented by a lion. It had been one of many things excavated from the ruins of Halicarnassus. This is purely conjecture on my part, but the lover knight was killed by a seed, and this could explain why she had so much hatred for seed. While on that note of Halicarnassus, the name is one of fans of Final Fantasy V will be quite familiar with. Halicarnassus was the name of the sorceress from Final Fantasy V. Halicarnassus existed in the Void, more specifically ruled over by a dimensional castle inside. Halicarnassus was known for their androgynous look. To further this connection, Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V does make an appearance in Final Fantasy VIII via the killing of Odin and taking his place. There is speculation the Void was meant to be loosely connected to all Final Fantasy worlds, though I think this was more of an Easter egg than an actual connection between the games. Something else of note to tie this back to the Roman Empire is Odin. The Roman Empire was defeated by an army of German barbarians called the Visigoths, led by a man named Odisir. We know from history German was a Nordic country, meaning they worshipped gods like Odin. So it's no coincidence the very guardian force who sits on the throne in Centra runes is Odin, cementing Centra's Greco-Roman connections even further. Something else of note is Final Fantasy VIII's strong connection to lions. The central theme around lions, and this is no coincidence. Lions are most known for being symbols of bravery and courage, and the world of Final Fantasy VIII is no different. The lion is meant to symbolize Squall's bravery to rise up to the occasion and defeat Ultimecia. The most prominent symbol of a lion comes from Squall himself. Squall's necklace, ring, gunblade, and gunblade case depict the lion Griever. It is what Squall perceived to be the strongest guardian force. Even the song that plays during the fight with Ultimecia is called Maybe I'm a Lion. We'd mentioned earlier of the historical king of Halicarnassus was represented by a lion, with a statue of a lion being erected at the mausoleum built in his honor. However, there is one other historical figure we need to take a look at though, this being Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a well-known general of the Greek kingdom of Macedonia. He was known for conquering much of the ancient world in his short lifespan. One of the cities conquered by Alexander the Great was the city of Halicarnassus. After the reign of Artemisia, the kingdom was eventually passed on to Ada and her husband. Both Ada and Artemisia II also controlled an army. Alexander would eventually lead a full-scale assault against Halicarnassus, being adopted by Ada and becoming the ruler of Halicarnassus, ending the reign of its Persian rulers. Alexander the Great is often depicted as wearing a helmet in the shape of a lion. Though it's believed this actually never did happen, the headdress was likely used through artwork to depict his lineage back to Hercules, which he claimed he was a descendant of. Hercules was also known for adorning the skin of the Nemean lion after its defeat. For the symbolism of how the lion directly ties back to Ultimecia, well, take a look through history. It was the symbol of the lion that eventually did Artemisia of Caria in, eventually destroying the once thriving empire. Her husband Mausolus was depicted as a lion and she had a great deal of grief over him, so the name Griever kind of makes sense. Tying this back to Final Fantasy VIII, I think it's safe to say somewhere along the lines Ultimecia probably lost her knight, whether that be through battle, old age, or disease. It likely drove her mad enough to turn her into the vicious warlord that we know her for today. In a weird way, she's even given her kingdom up to Squall by transferring her powers to Edea, who would ultimately assist in her demise, by raising the very army who would travel to the future and destroy her. To further this, the party is able to draw Alexander from the second fight with Edea, and it's in the next scene we learn of Ultimecia's existence. Interestingly enough, the usage of the lion, Halicarnassus, and Mausolus, Alexander the Great even add more fuel to the fire for the theory of Ultimecia is Rinoa, even though it's not a theory I personally enjoy or even want to entertain. The myth of Artemis was also a huge influence on Final Fantasy VIII. Artemis was the goddess of the moon and the goddess of the hunt. Artemis was often depicted in mythology as a moon. Her twin brother Apollo was the god of the sun. This explains the cycle of day and night. The moon plays a crucial role in Final Fantasy VIII. It's depicted quite a bit, and there is an overemphasis on how many of Final Fantasy VIII's cutscenes use the moon. The moon in Final Fantasy VIII plays a huge role because the crystal that once aligns with the moon would summon the Lunar Cry and send monsters down from the moon. The creation of lunatic Pandora was also aptly named after the moon. There are debates online of how to pronounce the word lunatic in Lunatic Pandora. Some say lunatic, others say lunatic. It's a fruitless debate because the name applies either way. The word lunatic, which is often used to portray someone who is crazy, comes from the Latin word luna, which means moon. It is believed by many at the time of the moon or patterns of the moon that affect the way people acted. Think of a werewolf and the idea of the full moon. There is also a running theory about how the full moon often makes people more crazy. So this idea of lunatic Pandora, it can be taken either way. The idea that the monsters come from the moon also ties very heavily into the myth of Artemis, to suggest that she was a goddess of the hunt, since the creatures of the world come from the moon. Artemis also fell in love with Orion. Their romance ended in tragedy, once Orion died. It's kind of unknown what killed Orion. Some believe that it was a scorpion that they were fighting, or some believe that it was the arrow of Artemis that accidentally shot him. The idea or the concept of Orion and Artemis is once again just a small nod to the idea of the sorceress and their knight keeping them together. The word Pandora in Final Fantasy VIII was also purposely chosen. Remember, Lunatic Pandora was a device created by Dr. Odine, and was a way for Adele to be able to weaponize the crystal pillar so she could summon the Lunar Cry at any time she wanted. Lunatic Pandora is shaped as a rectangular box. The Lunar Cry is known for bringing all sorts of chaos and destruction when monsters fall from the moon. The goddess Pandora was given the box by Zeus and told not to open it, but a curious Pandora opened the box because she was curious of what was inside, and released chaos into the world. This is to say that it was Pandora that released the concept of good and evil upon the world, tying myth of the Pandora back to Lunatic Pandora. Once again, Lunatic Pandora is used to unleash chaos unto the world. We've finally been able to piece together the origins of Ultimecia, but let's take this connection further and talk about Hein. Final Fantasy VIII's god, the most elusive figure. Hein is briefly mentioned within Final Fantasy VIII. There are 3 big nods to Hein: the Old Man in BALAMB Garden, the White Seed membership, a brief mention in Esthar, and outside of that, not much is known. Nojima did give us that epilogue, which we just read. Before we tie this all back together, there is one last piece of the puzzle that I do want to present. Here we are once again talking about psychoanalyst Carl Jung. I swear I don't do this on purpose, it just kinda happens. Let's familiarize ourselves with a couple of Jungian terms: the anima and the animus. In layman's term, the anima is the female part of the male psyche, and the animus is the male part of the female psyche. This is to say or really explain the feminine side of males and females, masculine side of females. The power of Hein, in my opinion, likely represents the animus, and that innate, domineering, power-hungry, ruthless nature that comes associated with the animus. This is, in my opinion, why Adele appeared so masculine, and why Ultimecia, though feminine, appeared to be very beast-like. Adele likely took a more masculine form to her personality, as that part of the male psyche more and more betrayed itself as more ruthless and brutal, and she became known for that domineering personality to take over the world that she had. I also believe this is why the more evil a sorceress was, their body began to appear more beast-like or masculine, much like Adele and Ultimecia. While Edea, albeit her beast-like appearance was more clothing-based thanks to Ultimecia, and Rinoa appeared more feminine. If the sorceress is the animus, then the sorceress's knight is the anima, the kind, loving, nurturing, protective side of the male personality. Remember, the goal of the knight was to protect the sorceress, not only from harm, but from herself. The love between a sorceress and her knight kept their powers at bay. We can see this with Cid and Edea, and later through Squall and Rinoa. The idea here, or the concept explored here, is the union of opposites, male and female, left and right, good and evil, conservative and liberal. It's likely to say that something balanced cancels each other out. The union of opposites needs to be met to play with each other's strengths and weaknesses in order to compensate for the other's flaws. The idea of the sorceress and her knight, in my opinion, is an exploration of this idea. It's likely to say when men and female, masculinity and femininity come together to work together and compensate for each other's weaknesses, great things can be accomplished. I do think Hein might have manifested in Ultimecia's true form, and by him going back in time, it was to reunite all those powers and become the ultimate god. That's purely conjecture on my part, though. Hein also plays a role as a trickster god from many different mythologies across the world. He shed his skin and gave them that power of magic, which was hidden from humans. Regardless, I think what Hein is at the end of the day is irrelevant. What I do think is important is taking a look at what Hein represents. Whether you are polytheistic or monotheistic, believe in the Judeo-Christian God, or consider yourself agnostic, those of us who believe there is a higher power that created the universe, or believe that there is an energy that created the world, or this algorithmic pattern that we live in, we don't understand really what God is, or are able to comprehend it. I think the story of Hein simply reflects our ability to create stories to explain things we cannot explain, and try to make sense of our materialistic worldview. The truth of the matter is, we won't know the full story of Final Fantasy VIII probably ever. Parts of Final Fantasy VIII are left ambiguous intentionally. It reflects our own history of antiquity. Just when we think we have the origins of humanity down, something appears and makes us question everything we thought we knew. Myth, religion, history, stories shaped the world of Final Fantasy VIII, just like they have ours. I think for many of us, that's what draws us to Final Fantasy VIII. It's that vague nature of not knowing what's going on, but combing through every bit of evidence we can find to piece it together, and getting frustrated when we realize we can't. It reflects our own desire to know our own purpose, origin, and existence in life, but reflects that frustration when we know we can't, and likely never will find it. It's what drives us to understand our own origins and ancient history. To clear something up regarding why Ultimecia wanted to find Adele and why Alone was needed, it was to send Alone back into Adele's past. Rinoa made a vague comment to Squall she saw a younger Adele when Rinoa was sent back into the past. It's never explicitly stated, but I think we can infer that Adele was probably around during the time of Centris falling, or shortly after, so she likely knew some of the events that took place, and likely had a key in developing many of Esthar's technologies, taking some of those technologies that were perhaps lost from the fall of Cetra. This also explains why Adele would have known where the pillar was. Out of any Final Fantasy game, I really do feel like Final Fantasy VIII needs a prequel, if you will, that allows the developers to be able to explore Laguna, Kyros, and Ward more closely and shine some light on the Sorceress War and Adele's past and who she was, though this is unlikely to ever happen. Final Fantasy VIII is a game I would consider to be pretty apolitical. It isn't trying to say anything profound or make major societal statements on things like Final Fantasy X or Final Fantasy VII, and it doesn't need to. Sure, there are some things that could be taken that way, some small themes I think the game touches upon, and authoritarian governments are terrible. Final Fantasy VIII lightly touches on why the constant cycle of war is never good, and I could make a strong argument as to why I think Adele from Esthar was representative of a World War II Germany dictator that I'm not allowed to name on YouTube. However, Galbadia was an army that brought the downfall of the Esthar Empire, much like the USA, and the European nations brought down World War II Germany, only to begin following in the very same slippery slopes of becoming the next war machine to rise. There are parallels here about those who seek power to obtain it and become corrupt, and I think Final Fantasy VIII's sorceresses could be taken as an allegory for nuclear war, or more specifically, the nuclear bomb. Each nation now has the capability to own them. The sorceress is a never-ending weapon of destruction that is used improperly. It is detriment to the world. At its core, Final Fantasy VIII is about love and friendship, placing your trust in close friends and working together to achieve common goals. Being a lone wolf can only get you so far in life. It's a simple message. Something else I think Final Fantasy VIII touches upon is the concept of the hero, or should I say the importance of the hero. It's reassuring to know that there can be a hero in all of us, and in most unlikely places. Every hero has its flaws, and this is reflected in both of our heroes in the story. Laguna is shy, lucky, and a bit of an idiot, yet his willingness to save those he loves around him gave him his strength. It was his love for Elone that gave him the ability to end Adele's reign. Squall struggles with losing his friends and letting people get close to him, distancing himself and refusing to let people in. It's other people in Seed and Rinoa that made Squall realize he needed friends. Had it not been for Squall placing his faith in his friends, he would have been able to come back from the future. Final Fantasy VIII's story isn't bad, it's just simple. It may not be as profound as Final Fantasy VII or X, as politically driven as tactics in Final Fantasy VI, or as deep as Final Fantasy IX. But it's just a fun story, and sometimes that's all a story needs to be. A fun, character-driven narrative that gets us excited to play the game. I hope if you hated Final Fantasy VIII in the past, or have heard some negative things about it, you give this game another shot, as I really do feel like it's worth it. And though I can acknowledge its flaws, I do think its pros outweigh a lot of the cons that it has. Hey guys, I just wanted to record this and just say something to kind of close this out. Because if you are watching this, you either more than likely thought that this was an entertaining video and are new to the channel, and I want to say welcome. Or most likely, you are more than likely one of the people who thoroughly enjoy my content and watch every video that I upload. And this video is directed towards you. I do want to say that I honestly really struggled to get this video out. There's a lot of personal things that have been happening in my life. There's a lot of things that have bogged me down. And it's funny because Final Fantasy VIII, in a way, exploring Squall's character yet again, really kind of made me realize that sometimes needing to talk to people is the best thing that you can do. And I'm feeling a lot better about things. I'm not going to go into detail about what happened and things like that, but I will just say on a note, I realized that there were some mistakes in the script. I realized there were some hiccups in the audio recording. I realized that there were some hiccups with some other things. And honestly, a lot of it is because this video is lucky that it even got out. And that said, I kept on saying I was going to do Final Fantasy VIII and I wanted to deliver. So you guys deserve better though. So from here on out is a commitment to do the best that I possibly can and make sure that things flow better than they did. I'm going to step up the story analysis portions, make them more interesting, take more time to edit that script, and make sure that I've got my bases covered on some things that I want to talk about, and for crying out loud, forgetting to record some footage or forgetting to hit record and just work on things. There are some exciting things coming to the channel that will be detailed out in an upcoming update video that will be dropping next Sunday. But thanks again everyone for sticking around, being there for me, watching my videos, and keeping the channel alive, because honestly it surprises me how much this channel has continued to grow, considering that I haven't uploaded in almost 7 months. But that said, that's the end of it. I have quite a bit planned this year. Again, we'll detail that in an upcoming update video. You guys will have full detail, full closure, and we will be doing some live streaming on the channel as we usher in a brand new year and make this the successful that we can. Thanks everybody. If you haven't done so already, be sure to hit subscribe, ring that bell notification so you do not miss a video when it goes live. Stay safe out there. Stay happy, be happy, game happy. Spoons is checking out.